Okay, I think we're live. Good morning, everyone. It's Saturday, April 29th, 2023, and we have another Saturday Free School for Philosophy and Black Liberation. As always, it's really nice to see everyone, and we're looking forward to see who's in the chat and will comment, participate in the conversation. We just finished listening to Marvin Gaye's song Holy Holy. Um, and there's another version as well that Aretha Franklin recorded that in some ways I like better, but that was also a nice version. But today we're going to continue our reading of Hegel's Science of Logic. But as always, before we go into the reading, we're going to first discuss an event that we had attended where Cornel West spoke, as well as addressing some remarks on string theory before we go into Hegel. So in order to do that, I'm going to hand it to Dr. Anthony Montero.
Thanks a lot, Emily, and good morning to everybody. We are going to go back to Hegel, but it's always useful to contextualize the reading of a text like this and to keep the text itself and our reading of it grounded in the reality that we live, including the ideological reality of this time. And so, without going for too long, I just wanted to talk about, as you said, Emily, the Cornel West event that we attended at the University of Pennsylvania. And there were a lot of questions that we had afterwards, and perhaps we could even, go through some of those questions again, because they're very, very fascinating, and they are philosophical, and they do relate to Hegel, the science of logic, the whole concept of a philosophical system, which I wish to explain in a moment. And then a little talk about unified theories. And the reason I just wanted to touch on that is because, in a certain sense, we in the Free School are attempting to forge a unified theory of Lenin and Du Bois, or the revolutionary and Marxist tradition of Europe and of the Russian Revolution, and the Black radical tradition, which is grounded in Du Bois. But I'll come back to that. And then talk about just some things before we read. Talk a little bit about how we should look at this great work, frankly, as a not yet complete work. And I think Hegel saw it that way himself, a work in progress. But let's start with Cornel West. Last Thursday, we attended a really, I think, important lecture by Cornel West. The two most important public intellectuals in the United States today are Noam Chomsky and Cornel West. And there are many, many things philosophically that they hold in common, I think. And their differences, I also think. As you know, Noam Chomsky is more a social scientist, a cognitive scientist, a theorist of language and grammars and semiotics, etc. Cornel West is a philosopher, a pure philosopher. It was a very fascinating lecture. I had not seen Cornel West in a couple of years in person, and I've only kind of kept up with him in relationship to his political commentary. In effect, as you know, his anti-Trump politics and his claim that Trump is a neo-fascist thug and so on, which then pushes him, of course, towards Bernie. And I think that's a real trap given Bernie's recent political practice relative to Robert Kennedy's announcement of his presidency, challenging Biden from a very progressive point of view, an anti-war, anti-militarist, anti-corporatist state position. And Biden could not hardly announce his candidacy before Bernie is endorsing him. I mean, in good faith, you could have waited at least, I mean, how do you just so quickly and easily jump on the Joe Biden bandwagon? And this is the most dangerous presidency in the history of the country, threatening war on 2 continents. I mean, because Trump is an alleged fascist, so I got to go with the guy that's pushing the world towards maybe a nuclear confrontation. Well, it doesn't make any sense, but it does make a lot of sense if you know that Bernie Sanders is a fake socialist, a fake progressive, and a political opportunist of the worst type. And I don't see any other way to put it. We cannot excuse him. We cannot apologize for it. Cornell, and this was the sad thing, although Cornell's lecture stayed at the level of philosophy and theology, by the way, it did not, he did say in passing that Biden would be better than Trump without making the argument. I think it was some of that which left most of us, and not quite me, I'll tell you why not quite me. I'm a bit biased for reasons that I tried to explain, but most of the people in the free school who were there found the lecture unfulfilling. I'll use that language. People can use their own. That Cornell's brilliance, you get a cat with a huge brain and all of this philosophy and literature and theory packed in, guy that also has apparently what is a photographic memory. So he's a formidable thinker, really a formidable thinker with a big heart. He's not satisfied with confining himself to his academic office or to a university. He goes into the world, engages with the world. And I should tell you, sometimes putting his own life in jeopardy. There was an instance in about 1998 at the Black Radical Convention in Chicago, and he and I happened to be there and together, and a guy stepped to Cornell in a threatening way, and I happened to step to the guy before he could, accost Cornell. And I'll never forget Cornell, was a bit shaken, I guess you might say. And he said, I'm a Christian, but I'm not a pacifist, you know, uh, and, blase, 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 But I'm just saying that to say I'm certain that for all kinds of reasons, a lot of people feel because he is accessible, he is in the world, he usually travels alone, although I kind of sense this time he had a security person with him uh, to help him out just in the event that somebody stepped to him. But I just say all of that to say that the man has a heart and he has a lot of heart. He's not a punk. He's not afraid in that regard. Um, and even in my own case at Temple University, he was so gracious to support me and to even come to a rally that we held, and then to appear at the Black Radical Tradition Conference and speak. And so I'm a little biased because of all of that, although, of course, philosophically, we're not on the same page. And just in his lecture, uh, his determining category is the category catastrophe. And his narrative is, how do you live a principled life in the face of social catastrophe? And then along with that, a principled moral life in the face of so many people bending to the politics of the dominant class. And so he is, when he speaks, and he deploys everybody from Chekhov to William James to Kierkegaard. I mean, I'm saying, I'm sitting there and I'm saying, oh, I'm hating, man. I'll never be able to know all of that. And then I said, man, I got to put some respect on your name, man. I mean, just to have achieved that, I'm, it's quite a bit. And to have achieved all of that knowledge and not used it for his own academic promotional reasons. As y'all know, he left Harvard in the early 2000s, I think, because the then president, what was his name? The economist, I forget his name, called Cornell, and this is when Cornell was a tenured professor, a full professor, in fact, at Harvard. And Lawrence Summers was the president. He called Cornell in to his office and tried to say intimidate is not really the word, literally to put him in his place. Literally saying to him, you should be grateful that you have this position at Harvard, and you should thank us, meaning we, the white establishment, every day of your life. And therefore, we want you to cease this engagement with the hip hop generation, with the younger generation, and withdraw into doing polite and acceptable academic things. I don't know what Cornell says, but I do know that Cornell can curse. He's from the hood, Sacramento. So he knows how to curse like I curse. And he may have cursed him out and told him to kiss his behind, and then left Harvard and took a position at Princeton. I I don't know whether Richard Rorty was still around, the philosopher, or who was around, but they told him, look, man, you don't have to put up with that. Come to Princeton, where he went, and then he went to Princeton. And then a few years, maybe 10 years later, the Black people in particular at Harvard said, Larry Summers is gone, and we want you back here. And we will guarantee you tenure, that you will get your tenure back. So when he went back to Harvard, well, everybody said, oh, yeah, Cornell's back at Harvard. You just assume he has tenure. But he didn't have tenure.
Really?
And I put that on the shoulders of the Black professors who told him to come back. And did not do what they needed to do to guarantee tenure. Tenure would give him the protection that a person like him needs, because he's going so much against the grain on so many things. Then it turns out about 2 years ago, comes out Cornell doesn't have tenure, and they're telling him, well, we'll give you a year-by-year contract and don't worry about it. And at that point, he left Harvard and took a position at Union Theological Seminary. I think that's where he began his teaching career, and that's where he is today. But you know, with all of that, he maintained his dignity, and this is important. When you're and he had to be betrayed in that Harvard, come back to Harvard thing, and humiliation in a certain sense. You know, because a lot of people who, for jealousy, envy, just don't like you because they just don't like you, kind of thing. You too large, you talk too much, all that, were on the sidelines snickering and laughing. Yeah, you know how that goes. I won't go into, but he handled himself with dignity. He goes back to Union Theological Seminary and hasn't missed a beat. He continues to be Cornell West and to do what Cornell West does as a intellectual and a public intellectual and a figure that lives with integrity and creates these wide discursive spaces where people like us can both agree and disagree. You see what I'm saying? By keeping the door to discourse, and serious discourse, not just some, Afrocentrism kind of, we're Africans and all of that, but drinking from the deep wells of human knowledge wherever he can find it. And of course, no one person in his mind, in his brain, can grasp the totality of human civilizations and knowledge. I mean, when I think about string theory, forgive me for a regression here. When I think about string theories and their claim of 10 dimensions of space and time, I'm often reminded of the Bhagavad Gitas, which talk about 7 time dimensions. But anyway, I mean, just to wrap your head around the Bhagavad Gitas and Plato's dialogues and Martin Luther. I mean, hey, look, you need an army of intellectuals who live monastic lives to grasp all of that. But Cornell, unafraid, unashamed, drinks from the wells of knowledge. And of course, he could be canceled, just like, why are you quoting Plato? He supported a slave-owning society. And plus, he's a white man and a man. That kind of cancel culture dismissal. Or thing with Chekhov, but he doesn't seem to be fazed by it. He continues pushing this high level of discourse, trying to make what is in the end a principled, moral, ethical argument about how to live a life that resists injustice at this time. Now, having said all of that, Cornel West is a combination of what we call neo-pragmatism, which is a unique American philosophy. Pragmatism arose in the United States as a philosophical movement in the middle of the 1800s. It morphed in the 1960s and 1970s into what we call neo-pragmatism. The fundamental argument of neo-pragmatism, first of all, it is American, but it's also English. It's an English-American, we call it Anglo-American philosophical move. As you know, the English philosophers, going back many ways to the beginning, we talk about George Berkeley or David Hume, John Locke, the beginning of English serious philosophy has always staked out its differences with European rationalism. In particular, what they call philosophy that attempts to build systems. In our case, Kant and Hegel. Pragmatism, and usually the founder of pragmatism is usually associated with a man named Samuel Peirce, whose work I really don't know, I have to be honest with you. And then further developed by Du Bois's mentor at Harvard, William James. But what pragmatism argues is that it philosophizes from the standpoint of the ordinary human being, not from the standpoint of a supposed rational system of philosophy and of knowing. Thus, it claims to be a democratic philosophy, a philosophy that upholds what I think Cornell has used this word, plebeian democracy, the democracy of the ordinary person. Hence, they often say it is philosophy without foundations, without prior assumptions, without categories. We've gone a bit through this, that Kant and Hegel think through categories. For instance, the categories of time and space, the category of being, the category of non-being. Each appeals, Kant and Hegel, to logic. Different logics, of course. Hegel, we know, dialectical logic. Kant, more traditional. Each, Kant and Hegel, were trying to align philosophy with science, in particular Newton and Copernicus, but Newton in particular, and to align science with philosophy. And this is why Hegel said that philosophy is a science. I think Kant would have agreed with that. Hegel said it is the science of science. Another way of saying that, it is the scaffolding upon which the meaning of scientific experiments and the meaning of scientific discoveries can be elucidated. Okay? This is a huge undertaking, by the way, huge undertaking, and remains a part, by the way, remains a part of the way we in the free school think. We'll come back to that. But Cornell starts from a pragmatist point of view, that it is the individual seeking meaning in a world that does not in and of itself provide meaning. That is why, if you listen to Cornell, there was always on the edge, if you will, of, or suggesting that we live on the edge of suicide, of, what Jean-Paul Sartre talked, being and nothingness. And how do we realize our being? It is through moral engagement with a world that will not give us meaning. It is living in good faith, moral good faith, in a world where things are commodified, where money trumps principle, and hence bad faith. You operate without a moral imperative, without a moral intentionality. You see where I'm coming from. His claim, so neo-pragmatists, and just a person, Richard Rorty is big in Cornell's West graduate studies at Princeton. Richard Rorty is the famous academic philosopher and neo-pragmatist at Princeton. He wrote his last book, a small book, but I think a very important and I should be famous book, entitled Achieving Our Country. The title of the book he takes from James Baldwin. And Rorty attacks the intelligentsia and the academics who have abandoned the working class. It is a great book, a great manifesto, which takes, the whole question of the plebeian or democratic thrust in philosophy, I think, to an important place of engagement. But this is Cornell, a plebeian, a people's philosophy, a people's framing philosophical and moral issues from the standpoint of the ordinary person. And that is why I think he has this great fidelity, but this great commitment to the blues with critique. And I didn't quite agree with his critique, but the blues, which is the narrative of the ordinary people. The blues talking about navigating, the narration of disappointment, but the narration of overcoming, of resilience, of I'm still here in spite of everything type of thing. He considers the blues to be a very high expression of living morally in a world that tries to undermine your efforts to do that. The pressure is to sell out all the time. But here's the blues man, the blues woman, saying that we can still be principled in spite of the pressure to sell out. So Cornell calls himself a blues, what did he say? A blues man of the mind. I think something like that. He has such interesting formulations. But he sees himself as a blues man and as a traveling musician. He also sees himself in relationship, not the blues and John Coltrane. And this scaffolding, this architecture of morality coming out of Black resistance is so much a part of him and the way he lives. And, even as he talked about music, you all might remember, and he really digs Philadelphia, loves Philadelphia because of Philly's music. And he says Philadelphia is a soulful city. And he mentioned the OJs. He meant, and his soundtrack, by the way, is the same soundtrack as the Free School. The same music that we listened to, he was gesturing to. The Isley Brothers, I think, did he mention Harvest for the World? One of those great calls to morality, to resistance. And of course, he talked about Stevie Wonder's song Love's in Need of Love, all which is like us. And the moderator, who I was not too thrilled by, we'll talk about that a bit, because I know some people weren't there, like Seraphita, so I'm filling in, creating a picture. But the moderator, when Cornell was talking about the OJs and the Isley Brothers, he tried to say Meek Mills. Now, how you get from that to that, I don't see it. But Cornell resisted it, and in his generous way, of course, without saying I disagree, but just saying the music that he stands upon. He's absolutely right about this. He's absolutely right. That blues, jazz, R&B is still the strong hand in our music and poetry. But along with neo-pragmatism, I hope I didn't go too far afield, is existentialism, a contemporary form of existentialism. And this is, again, where I would find myself in a bit of a difference with Cornell. For him, the important existentialists would be people like Karl Jasper, spelled Jasper, and Albert Camus, not Jean-Paul Sartre. The radical, the communist, the socialist, the anti-colonialist. Not Jean-Paul Sartre, but Albert Camus, who in fact opposed the Algerian independence movement. By the way, this is something that James Baldwin spoke about as well in one of the essays in No Name in the Street. I think the first one, entitled Take Me to the Water. Jimmy Baldwin did not like Albert Camus either, and felt, like Sartre, that Albert Camus was pro-colonialist and operated in bad faith. But so it is this sense of the absurd, and in philosophical and existentialist terms, the absurd means non-being or no meaning or lack of meaning. Mm-hmm. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And so it is this tightrope that Cornell navigates upon. To me, it is interesting, it is dramatic, it is exciting. Like I said, I got to put some respect on your name, hometown. You remain so energized, so hopeful, so alive. You know what I'm saying? Where it would be easy to say, to throw in the towel. I've been doing this for too long, uh, 3 of my marriages broke up because of this. I'm going to throw in the towel. But he stays real. He stays alive, and he remains who he is and welcomes difference and critique. That's the positive thing. Philosophically and in terms of social theory, I feel that his approach does not account for a big part of human history, including the Russian and Chinese revolutions, the revolutionary leaderships of these movements, and their philosophies and theories. It does not account for philosophies paralleling science or philosophies in the Hegelian and Kantian sense, attempting to correct science and to clarify for scientists and non-scientists what the discoveries of science suggest in scientific terms and in human terms. That tradition is usually associated with what is called rationalism, although it's much, much more than that. Can you see what I'm saying? Cornell's position is more in the English American tradition of empiricism, pragmatism, and existentialism. There is not, I guess we could put it this way, using what we've already read in Hegel. There is not in pragmatism and neo-pragmatism. In fact, they reject the whole concept of mediation. It is all resolved at the level of the immediate and of the individual. And not to mention that English philosophers, I would say everybody from John Stuart Mill through Bertrand Russell and up to the present, have always smeared Hegel as somehow being the source of authoritarianism and even Nazism. That the rationalist tradition, especially as it crystallizes in Hegel's philosophy, can only lead to anti-democratic practices. And that to return democracy to philosophy, you have to separate philosophy from what is called the rational tradition, or thinking through categories. We can come back to that. So it is a claim, and I think this is a problem for Cornell, because it generalizes, in fact, reduces the question of democracy to an Anglo-Saxon practice. That everything that is not Anglo-Saxon in its theory and practice of democracy is by definition authoritarianism. Well, does it sound familiar? Yes, it does. Because that's the paradox that the Biden administration and the US ruling class tries to present us with. Either Anglo-Saxon democracy or authoritarianism. Either John Locke and John Stuart Mill or Hitler, or as I won't say my friend, but a guy that I follow, Lex Friedman is always doing, sadly, this conjunction of Mao, Stalin, and Hitler. They're all the same, you know. But that's the Anglo-Saxon smearing of human revolutionary um, uh, aspirations. So when you listen to Cornell, he is operating and thinking within the folds of Anglo-American philosophy, and hence the unusual in the political arena that does not fit the narrative of Anglo-American democratic theorizing and narrative is thereby authoritarian and even neo-fascist. And I want to underline the unusual, because the thing of Anglo-American philosophy has become a dogma rather than a project of scientific critique of democracy and the possibilities of changing it, of advancing it. I just want to say a couple of few other things. In this sense, and if you all were there, people who were there, we kind of saw it. You know, we saw a crescendo in his narrative. And it was, to me, it was exciting because I'm trying to kick the goal. You know, all of these people, you know, I've read, I know a little bit about, but he seemed to weave this narrative out of all of these thinkers, from Chekhov to Kierkegaard to William James, and just, I mean, that's unbelievable. But that's why I said I got to put some respect on your name. But in the end, he reaches the apogee, and he couldn't go any further. And then it had to be a repeat. It had to be a saying of similar things that he had previously said. Because he refused to go to the world of contradiction, of possibility, of danger. He stayed within this beautiful narrative, this exciting narrative that he started with. The other thing is his constant referencing and gesturing to Christianity in the sense of liberation Christianity or Black Christianity. No problem. As we all know through our own experiences and observations, that Black religion is a religion of resistance, that being is realized in becoming, as Martin Luther King said in his one of his graduate school papers. Being is in becoming. That for Black Christianity, the end is not an end. It is the beginning of something new. And he's right about that. But then, to me, there's a paradox between Anglo-American political theory and philosophy and Black Christianity, which is not grounded in the individual, or not grounded, as Cornel West suggested, in fake hope in the future. It is futuristic, but not this Disneyland futurism of the standard ruling class narrative in this country. And just my last point, I think he gets King wrong. King was not a naive pacifist. If you want any evidence of that, just listen to the speech Why Oppose the War in Vietnam. King understood St. Thomas Aquinas's differentiation between just and unjust wars. I don't think that Cornell understands the actual and practical real life meaning of that as it relates in particular to the Ukraine war. Is Russia an imperialist nation, as he says, or is Russia defending itself against the imperialism, militarism, and aggression of the United States? Were the Vietnamese waging a just war? Were the Koreans waging a just war? Were they waging a war for peace? King understood that. He understood the difference between just and unjust wars. And I think that rather than pigeonholing King into this nebulous, ill-defined category of pacifism, King was far too philosophically developed to be reduced to that. What Cornell has not considered is that King, in fact, was a theorist and practitioner of the struggle for democracy. A peaceful means, a political rather than a civil war path to the democratic and political transformation of the American nation. To disarm the ruling elite in its efforts to pit Black against white in the struggle to change the country for Black and white people. That is what King was saying. He was a theorist and a practitioner of the struggle for democracy. The concept of love. You cannot, in King's sense, appeal to pragmatist or neo-pragmatist philosophers or to English theorists of liberal theory or society to understand King's concept of love and the beloved community. It seems that Cornell missed a tremendous opportunity to further develop, to further deepen, to further extend his own theory of moral behavior and moral action. How beautiful might it have been if he could have turned or extended that discourse to King's notion of the beloved community, which goes hand in hand with his idea of the means to radical transformation as important, this is King, as important as the ends themselves. So King was talking about a democratic path to achieve a new democracy that unites and transforms the people in the process I don't think the philosophical, the philosophies that ground Cornell necessarily predisposed him to that kind of Kingian or even Baldwinian thinking. I'll stop there and just say that we had a rich discussion for the time that it lasted on Thursday evening. And I'll stop there, Emily, and maybe we can have a little discussion of it.
Yeah, thanks, Doc, for that, because even after because when we talked after the event, even like, because you had tried to explain some stuff to us, and like, it's true, I think everyone had a lot of different questions. I feel like I have not been able to make sense of where Cornell West was coming from, like philosophically. Like, I was very confused because I think when you pinpointed the paradox and actually said it just now, that was actually really clarifying for me. The paradox, like the paradox between an Anglo-American political theory and philosophy and Black Christianity. For me, that was the thing that really confused me, because I was like, there were parts where I was really down with Cornel West, where especially when he started talking about, he was referencing the blues and jazz, not just as a musical thing, but as a philosophy, or like motion, like trying to motion about something, about what it could mean for human beings and our behavior in society. But then at the same time, and then he would say things like, in some ways, and because if you take the blues and jazz seriously, then you have to take King seriously. So he even said, for example, he was like, people say King is old, but I would tell them King is fresh as foam.
Yeah.
He made the comparison to the blues again. He said, if you think King is old, that's like saying Sarah Vaughan is old. But if you listen to Sarah Vaughan, she could be now. Like, that music is now. So that was one thing. But then there are times where I was like, I feel stuck. Like, I literally got a headache, actually, because my brain felt stuck because I was waiting to be freed. And I never felt like in that room I was able to be freed, if that makes sense. And I think some of it also, I thought about it, I was like, because in free school, we talk a lot about the fierce urgency of now. And we're constantly evaluating where specifically the American people are at, the motions, because I feel like for us, we have this basic assumption that the people are always moving. Like, the world is always moving, the people are always moving. And so I feel like we're constantly assessing, like, what does Trump mean? Like, what about peace and war? Like, the question of peace and war, how are the American people seeing the world? What about the rise of Asia? Like, we have all these questions, and especially with the question of Trump, especially, and like also because I forget what the F stands for, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., RFK Jr., he gave this 2-hour speech to announce his presidential campaign. Right. And now you have someone who's technically running on the Democratic side. You have someone, at least to this point, running on the Republican side, these people who are staunchly anti-war. And we have this realization that the American people will never be the same. This discourse, like, everyone, there's almost like you can feel there's a rising awareness from the people of the center cannot hold. And there's a future that's opening up. Like, there's a huge sense of an opening up of possibilities for the people. And I think that's why I was like down with a lot of what Cornel West was saying, especially when it's the parts where he talked about, blues and jazz and what that meant for him to even understand King. But then there's the part of him that was like, King is a pacifist and I'm not pacifist. Just war, like unjust versus just war. But then also I really, when he made that passing comment about how Biden is better, he was like, well, I think Biden is better than Trump. I was like, to me, I was like, then you are telling me that you don't want me to be free. Like, there's something in there where I was confused. I was like, where is this coming from? How can you both how can you have such a huge reference point in your being and thinking and teaching of this liberatory philosophy of Black Christianity, of like the blues and jazz. Like there's something there, but then at the same time, I feel like I even felt from him, I was like, oh, I don't even know if you completely understand your place in the changing motion of this country.
Mhm.
Like, because I feel like that's the challenge for a lot of people. And I feel like that goes back to philosophy. Like, or that's what I got from your presentation, Doc, where that's why philosophy becomes so important.
Yeah.
Because I had asked Kathy, I was like, what does mediation mean again? Because I think that's a really important point about Cornel West, but also not just Cornel West, but other people like Noam Chomsky, but just people in general. What is like for these public intellectuals who play such an important role in the ideological landscape that especially young people will grow up with, especially on universities and college campuses? It's a question of like, do you have on a basic level the tools or the knowledge to be able to interpret, see, to actually know how to know what's going on? And that point about, and that's philosophy, but specifically like the point that you made, Doc, about how Cornell's coming from this American English tradition of pragmatism, like he's a neo-pragmatist.
Mm-hmm.
But that is a belief of immediate, that like individual can immediately or like from an immediate level interpret whatever's around them versus, and then when I asked Kathy to clarify what does mediation mean, she was like, well, if the comparison is that Hegel, like we've been reading, Hegel has this belief that it's not simply on the level of the immediate, but there's a mediation, like a knowledge framework or like something that you may need to be able to interpret, like that's between the individual and then interpretation of what's around you. And that's a key because and then okay, I feel like I'm not doing a good job, but I'm trying to.
You're doing a very good job.
But then that thus leads the comparison between this Anglo-American tradition of pragmatism and then basically Hegel and even Kant, this idea of like, well, how, because logic in some ways is the question of logic and being in these categories. It's this idea that you need categories, that people need categories, they need a scaffolding, they need a framework to interpret the world or what's around them. Like that also leads to the distinction between like the way you clarify, Doc, that for example, a neo-pragmatist like Cornel West would think that what Hegel's saying is anti-democratic because you already have an understanding of a liberal theory of like democratic. Whereas Hegel's saying like you need those categories to be able to understand, like there needs to be categories, a framework to be able, it's not just simply on the level of the immediate, but there is a level of mediation. I don't know. Okay, that's where my brain left off. Oh yeah, but I think Kathy and Alice had things they want to add on. Hopefully they can complete my thought. But oh yeah, but I guess your last point too about King, that's also why, because when Kathy and I were briefly talking on the side, I'm sorry if you saw us on the camera. Oh yeah. I realized I was like, because that's what free school's doing. There's a philosophic nut we're trying to crack. Or there's a philosophic, okay, Jeremiah, they're laughing at me, but there's a philosophic nut that we're trying to crack, which is how is it that free school, for example, we understand King philosophically, that King lays the groundwork of a certain philosophic, or you could say political framework of understanding democracy, like revolutionary democracy. But in some ways that's like we said, connecting it to last week, that's why we made this, we talked about how Hegel, rather than Hegel going to Marx and then us coming from Marx, it's Hegel to Du Bois and then back to understanding Hegel. Like we're cracking this philosophic nut of Hegel, King, Du Bois. And when you have that kind of framework, when you have a central category, the Black proletariat, similar to how Robeson, because he understood the central category of the Black proletariat, he could then understand the universality of humanity, especially dark humanity across the world. And so like this is the philosophic nut that we're trying to crack by even reading Hegel. Like we've done a close reading of Du Bois, and now in some ways we're trying to like really expand or like define or really like nail down this, like in some ways like liberatory philosophy. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll stop there.
No, I think that's interesting because how Doc was also talking about history and the lack of history in Cornell West.
Yes.
Coinciding his
that
philosophy.
Is true. That is true.
And then also what you said about how philosophy coincides with sciences, challenges it, corrects it, and is like in tandem with science. But Cornell West's philosophy is not in tandem with science.
No, it's not.
That being interesting because of the synthesis that we're making in free school about the Du Bois Lenin, that synthesis, but then King, Du Bois, Hegel synthesis, the logic or the philosophy of free school, the framework that the free school is also like the nut that we're trying to crack, has to also do with, and what you're saying is that we have a particular framework to understand our moment today, and that the ideology that we are like the ideological struggle is dependent on what it is that we know and how we read our moment and the history like of King and struggle and things like that. But just to add on to what you're saying, I think history is like an important puzzle to that. But
I think actually this might be relevant also to Serafina's point, which is that you can't really, what was apparent in Cornell is that you can see the struggle in terms of individual struggle, whether it's like through the blues or through the civil rights movement, but you can't just leave it at the individual level. It's how are the strivings of individuals representative of a larger mass struggle of people? And that was one thing that I noticed. But also immediately when Cornell started his presentation, I was like, Shambarto and I looked at each other and were super confused, because one of the first statements he said was actually like most people are not good. It's like he was saying most people are not good. Like in society, there's like a small group of individuals that actually have a moral, like that will make a moral choice for the rest of society. And like Shambarto, was that like, did I get that correctly? Because he said something to that effect, and Shambarto and I just looked at each other and we were so confused, because that's so different from what we're saying in free school, which is like, what's the capacity actually of most human beings to do good, to be good, to want to strive. And I think that was like one moment, like very from the start, where I was conflicted. And the other is because it came like coming from free school, that's what we're always talking about. Like, what do we believe in human beings? And I think the other reason why I was also like less enamored by him is because he does have such a great responsibility. Like this was a room of about like maybe 200 people, and many of them were young college students, like from the University of Pennsylvania. Like, what does it mean when you're telling young people, like, actually, most people are not good and you need to find a way, like, in spite of that, like, I think his moral is essentially like, you have to choose the right, like, make the right choice. But how is that positive or encouraging when you're basically saying, like, you as an individual in the face of immorality, in the face of a society that's on the brink of collapse, that you have to fight against it alone, basically. But having this conversation of how that actually, what can explain his stance through the lens of philosophy, like pragmatism was really helpful, because that's essentially the lens of pragmatism, and which is something I was unfamiliar with. The thing with Cornell West and also with Noam Chomsky is that they're like significantly like huge public intellectuals, because in undergrad, I was in the math and sciences. And so I was less exposed to the humanities. but even then I knew like I've heard of people like Cornel West, of Noam Chomsky. And I think that speaks to the piece of how much responsibility they have to Americans and of the youth. The other point that made all the sense is if you're through the lens of pragmatism, you also are closed off to a world of Afro-Asia, where you're being shown hope, not in the idealistic sense, but of actually of people striving to change a system that that's on the brink of collapse. And because he's unable to reach that, like he didn't really talk about like Ukraine, Russia in this conversation, but you can see that he was essentially shut off from the rest of the world, because you can't reference the civil rights movement without referencing how, the way that Du Bois says, like the struggle of Black America is on par to the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution. And I think it's because of that it also limits like what the possibilities are of people in America, and of how they can see themselves as part of a world, like of a struggle of humanity throughout the world.
Yeah, so I wanted to add, like, Doc, in what you were saying, like the fact that you draw the distinction between, like, Jaspers and Camus and Sartre on the other hand, and the fact that, Cornel West and, this, like this philosophy of pragmatism that is centered on, one of them, it's centered on Camus and Jaspers. I think this was really clarifying, and like what Alice was mentioning, like like at the start, I think this is like the reaction that we have, like trying to be trained in like people like King and Du Bois and Baldwin. This is a reaction that we have, when like this sort of narrative is put in front of us, that it's the majority of people who I think he said something to the effect that caring has always been a minority movement. It's not something that has ever been a mass struggle. I think that's what Alice was also referring to. And this is very different from like all revolutionaries that we read and study. Like this has always been the way. But I think the reason that like this kind of narrative, this holds so much ground, especially in like academic and university circles, is because of like this distinction between these sort of opposed philosophies, which also seem similar. Because like at one point I thought Sartre and Camus are basically the same thing, but now like I'm realizing how far apart they are. And I think like this has like this has to do with like the conclusions that you come to once you're faced with the existential questions. And all of these philosophers have confronted the existential question of death, and the fact that the fact about like the existential nature of life, and that there is a dissonance between the reality of death and like something else about life, something something which is filled with the creative spirit of life. And I think like this is like the distinction which I'm thinking of, is the conclusion that they come at, like like for Jaspers and Camus, when you're faced with the existential question of death, the answer is a retreat to the individual. And like for Camus, it's about like accepting the absurdity or whatever. But basically, what he's saying is that you can't really find any answer to it anywhere outside of yourself. And I think this is also similar to what Jaspers says. We had been reading some like an essay which describes some of his works, and like the fact that he thinks that liberation comes once we accept that we are doomed. But on the other hand, like the other answer that Baldwin comes up with is that death is the only thing that connects people. And like like faced with the reality of death is what like is the moment when we realize that yes, we are living in a world house. Like this is what King is talking about. This is what Baldwin is talking about. And this is the distinction that this is the distinction which I think lies behind like how you see people, because it's rooted in like a question of love.
Yeah.
And this is also what you were talking about, like I was thinking of this one question that somebody asked Cornel West at the like at after his lecture, and I think this it was a young woman who was asking about how to keep loving in the face of disappointment, and Cornel West's answer to this was also I thought it was also a narrow answer. He was mostly talking about romantic love and relationships and so on. But I think the when King talks about love, like it's not the romantic or even the brotherly love that he's talking about. It's this what he calls the stern love, taking responsibility to transform someone or society. And I think this is what he completely misses, or what these other absurdists or other philosophers, they are also missing out on this. And I think unless you come to terms with what this love really means, which is related to accepting death as something that connects humanity, without this there isn't a way forward. This is what I think. This is what it's becoming clarifying. Why part of his talk felt unsatisfying, unfulfilling, as you were saying. I think it's because of this, because he fails to see the potential that he himself has. It seems because he does have a lot of a lot of people are looking up to him. They are looking up to him for guidance and clarity. And I think the feeling I had was he can save so much more. He is talking about King, but he is missing the essence of King. And I think it's this question of love and the broadest form of love. And this is where you have to see people as in terms of their capacity, not simply as where they're at now, but in terms of capacity. And yeah, I think we'll keep coming back to this probably, because I think this is also what Hegel is saying. When he says that we can know, it's not about how much we know at this point, but the history of humanity is that we have always been able to know more. And yeah, this comes from a deep, faith and belief in humanity, which clearly this is this is why these philosophies are the ones that are being championed by the ruling class, because you cannot have a genuine philosophy which can transform the people and has belief in the people. That can never be the philosophy of a ruling class.
Yeah, I know you wanted to say something, Jeremiah, but I just had a question. Doc, could you clarify what the category of catastrophe? Like, I'm really where does that come from? Because I'm confused by it. Because I feel like the central category of catastrophe for Cornel West, I think, is related to what Shimbarta's pointing out about the difference between that versus, let's say, a central category of the Black proletariat, which is essentially the becoming or the capacity of the ordinary person, or basically the proletariat. Which also leads you into this whole realm of other stuff, like the belief that, because I was really struck by the question you posed, Doc, where you're in some ways Cornel West asks the question, how do you live a principled life, a morally principled life in the face of catastrophe when everyone is going to bend toward the dominant class, versus the question I feel like my natural question from the get-go, which I hope other young people would begin with too, is what has been the history? It's this thing when we talk about the sky, where it's how moving it is to ask the question of what have my ancestors before me achieved? What is the revolutionary tradition? Where is the beauty around me? I feel like those are kind of different starting points. So I just wanted to ask what is this catastrophe thing, and where does it come from?
Well, that's where I think he kind of began, but it is a see, he's speaking and thinking as a moral philosopher, ethical philosopher, and so he has to define what the conditions that we live in. And so catastrophe is a category or a concept of we live in an absurd moment. We live in a moment where we're close to death. So that is what of moral, and he would argue, I think he would say, if you asked him, that we have entered a period of moral catastrophe, a period of the emptying out of meaning, and examples of moral and democratic action. Another way to put it, politically, he would say that we progressives are waging a rear guard action, that counter-revolution and anti-revolution is far stronger than the moral compass, the moral imperative. So catastrophe, in this existential sense, denotes the collapse of meaning, and thus, again, referencing, let's say, Sartre, the beginning of non-being. I hope that helped to explain it.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, because I was thinking about, the category of catastrophe too. And I think, like, going into the lecture by Cornel West, I was most interested to see how, like, because I knew that he came from the pragmatist tradition, but I didn't actually know that much about it other than having read Rorty's Achieving Our Country. And so I was curious to see how that philosophical tradition would be put to use, or how it would actually like materialize in the conversation. And yeah, so like your opening remarks were really, really clarifying in that regard, like actually showing like the larger scaffolding and framework of where that tradition sits. And this is just a hypothesis, I guess, but I feel like someone like Cornel West is someone who is in some ways produced by, and is like, he's produced by like the how would you say, like the period of counter-revolution against the Black freedom movement. He's someone who is trying to make sense of the assassinations of King, but also basically the overturning of the civil rights movement. Because he is someone who emerges in prominence basically like late 70s, mostly the 1980s, if I'm correct. And from then on, he becomes like more prominent. But I feel like that's also how, like, why the catastrophic is such an important category for him, because for him, he views it as almost like an eternal thing. But actually, what I think he fails to realize is that that was a historically constituted thing. Like that period of basically disappointment and disillusionment after, I think some of the aspirations of the civil rights movement were not totally fulfilled. And I think in that sense, what was interesting, and other people have said this already, but like what's interesting is like how you choose to interpret the historical moment that we're living in now. Because one way you can look at it is like, oh yeah, like things continue to be catastrophic. And that's one way of looking at like where we are right now in like American history or world history. But actually we see the current moment, like we as in the free school, we see the current moment much more optimistically. And we actually see something like the Trump movement as not like one more symptom of the catastrophic, but actually something that points towards like the emergence of something new, even if in itself, like the Trump movement is not fully realized. But he can only view things through this lens of like continuing catastrophe. And then in that mode, like, yeah, what are the choices that human beings can make, or like the individual person can make, which is, I think in some ways it can be useful. Because I was thinking about, or like thinking about like our own experience in college. I feel like, at least for me, the natural place where a young person starts is the existential in many ways.
That's true.
And I think that some of the questions that the students were asking or in some ways like indicative of that, of like, oh, like how do I live, basically how do I live a moral life when Penn is like doing all these things and all of that, which I feel like is natural in some ways, and he's trying to like respond to that. But on the other hand, it's like what Emily was saying, it's you can't stay like there's, and also like with the way that you describe like two different strains of existentialism, like one being represented by Camus and the other being represented by Sartre, was interesting, and I hadn't fully put that together before. But there's a way of doing existentialism which actually leads towards like the world historic, it leads towards something like Hegel in some ways, but or like trying to make sense of not just what is like what should I do as a person, like how can I live a moral life, but also yeah, like where do I stand in relation to history. And I feel like the other interesting like the two other interesting things that I remember really distinctly from this, or a few other things, is there's a point when Cornell was talking about the role of the artist as the vanguard of humanity, which I actually thought was really interesting.
Yeah.
But the way that he explained it then was confusing, because he was almost like, there was a point where he said, like, in the period of catastrophe, like philosophy is far down the chain of like what human beings should be concerned with, and actually art is the thing that is like the foremost, which I feel like was very unnecessary. Like you don't have to be like this huge distinction between philosophy and art, because I feel like they are like almost in some ways like they can be seen as almost like the same thing. And it was interesting to reflect on that moment, because I feel like what we're saying in the free school is actually the opposite. Whereas like actually in a moment of crisis, philosophy becomes very important. Whereas the reason, it was almost like the reason why he was saying like in a period of catastrophe, philosophy is like far down the chain, is because that's coming from the pragmatist in him, where when he says philosophy, it's more like he's gesturing towards like the metaphysical philosophy,
Right.
like the philosophy of Kant and Hegel, and like the like quote unquote abstract, where he's like, oh, I'm dealing with the practical, like what are the practical things that human beings need to do, like the ethical and moral questions that human beings need to deal with in a time of catastrophe. So that was interesting. The other interesting, sorry, I know I'm going on, but like the other interesting points that I picked up on were how he was simultaneously trying to like escape like an association with the American tradition, but also was in other ways reaffirming it because of his defense of the pragmatic tradition, but also like moments when he was like, I like Chekhov more because he rejects this American
Optimism
with the future. Or like the sense of optimism, the sense of there is always a future that Americans have. And yeah, it was weird to me because I was like, one, like I disagree that having a sense of the future is a bad thing, or that it is like it is always just like a idealist thing. But it was weird because on the one hand he was like trying to be like position himself against like a kind of association with the American tradition, but also in other ways like reaffirming it too, with like him being like, oh, actually, like ultimately he returns back to like the pragmatist thing, which is a product of like the Anglo-American thing that you were describing. And then the last thing I guess was I just feel like others have said this, but like the overall atmosphere of the event itself, I think in some ways was a bit triggering for me because it's like it does remind you of, like the kinds of atmosphere and environment that like some of us who like were in, I guess, like elite universities. It's like that whole thing where like the audience really liked him and they were like always affirming him because in some ways he was like challenging but also not really challenging some of their basic assumptions. And like it was more like there was a huge part of Cornell which is not just the content of what he does but the performance of how he relays his points. And Cornell is both like the philosopher but also a performer. And like that also has to be taken into account because that is partially like his role as a public intellectual. And like when you go to a Cornell West talk, you're expecting a certain way that he talks, which is like pretty impressive, but also I feel like at the same time, it was almost like he was like scandalizing the liberal audience, but only up to a point. And it's like up to a point where they're like actually like they're scandalized by some of the things that he's saying about the Democratic Party, but also they kind of like it. Where it's almost like that like Baldwinian, like the erotic liberal thing where you're like I don't know, that was interesting because yeah, like it's been a while since I've been in that kind of space, and to see like how he relates to that kind of audience, like both in good faith, but also like I don't know if he fully even realizes like what kind of performance he's doing and like what how that is received by people. But yeah, those were like just some thoughts that I had. But it was in some ways it was like, oh damn, I haven't been in this kind of space in a while. Everyone is like like they're all like tittering, like kind of like making like these small noises. And in some ways Cornell like affirms that, but he's also trying to challenge them at the same time, which I feel like it's like a weird space that he occupies. But yeah.
Well, I just want to add to what Jeremiah was saying because this was my first time listening to Cornel West speak, and was very interesting. And I think I was impressed on many counts, but then not on some others. And I like that he talked about love and he talked about the need to be humble. I appreciated that he made it a point to repeat that over and over. And I also got the sense that he was deeply loved, especially in the Black community, um, which I mean, I didn't have a sense of before, so that was interesting. But it made me think a lot about, the role, but also the duty of the intellectual in these times. How you have to deploy analysis and philosophy with a particular bent, which is to explain the times and also put make it clear what people's choices are, what kind of choices exist in this time, and where you can be positioned with respect to these choices. And this is why, again, I agree with everybody. The opening introduction doc you gave was very clarifying, because it's clear that many of the sort of conclusions that he reaches that I don't agree with, and I think in free school most of us would not agree with, comes from that narrow lens of pragmatism, because it sort of keeps you shackled to the immediate without having your eyes on the eternal. That is why, for instance, even this kind of an analysis of a lesser evil, Biden being a lesser evil than Trump for this immediate moment, becomes a reasonable explanation of what's going on right now. And that's why, even when it comes to the Ukraine war, you either don't say anything, or you position yourself with the US military industrial complex, because you're thinking about not this like king, like broad terms, the empire of eternity, a moral dimension. But then it also, the other thing that was very clarifying to me from the discussion that was going on was how, in his analysis, the revolutionary history of the world does not play as strong a factor as it should. Because even this question of being, and we are realizing this now because we've started reading some South Asian philosophers, more Eastern school, this question of being itself, I mean, is different. It's very different for an oppressed people as opposed to an on the oppressing people, because an oppressed human being, when he thinks about what it means to be, he has to do it within a society or within a world system which tries to negate his entire being and tries to negate his very humanity. And so it leads to formulations of democracy and freedom, and even like Shambartu was saying, ideas about mortality and life that are fundamentally different and more revolutionary than can be built out of like pragmatism, for instance. And without engaging with these things, I think that's why Du Bois and Baldwin have something to offer to us today. Then a lot of the people Cornel West mentioned probably don't. I mean, yeah, I just wanted to add that I found these things missing from a lot of his analysis.
Yeah, this was also my first time listening to Cornel West, and I haven't even read a lot of Cornel West. So when he spoke and I took in the entire thing, there were a lot of contradictions that I was having trouble understanding. However, I think today's discussion really helped that, like framing it in this neo-pragmatist line or thought really helps understand like several things. Um, Especially the point that Chamberto was making about love, and he mentions that to love is to die, and that sort of elicited a really like Jeremiah was saying, a tittering response. But when you really look at it, and he brings in King in order to make that point. But when you look at it, his idea of love and his idea of death doesn't go beyond a certain level of analysis, which is why that um, which is why when he says that, oh, to love is to die, it falls short. It falls short in that narrow pragmatist way, and because he's not thinking of some death or mortality as something that unites us, but something that is purely concerning the individual. But a lot of respect to the man, because his oratory skills and the way that he recalls so many things are, as you said, worth that respect. Like he's a really great figure, and he has this position of intense responsibility. Uh, but again, I think trying to bring in all of that knowledge and all of that thought, um, and applying it to the world rather than to, like these narrow subcategories, I think that's where it falls short, because he mentioned I'm with my Dalit brother. I mean, that was something that I heard, and I was like, okay, you are you're sort of saying that you're in line, or you're relating to this extremely narrow group of people within Indians. Well, you could have said Indian brother, but no, Dalit brother, uh, and that really made me think about what we read last time in Hegel, where he thinks of this totality, and we're all parts of totality. We're all like parts of a whole rather than individual parts coming together to form something. And that is really the distinction which I felt that his philosophy has with the philosophy that we are trying to develop at this point. um, so yeah, I think I agree with everybody's criticisms, as well as keeping in mind that he is not somebody to be ignored. He is somebody who people look up to, and he has that position to really affect the minds and lives of people.
Yeah. So I thought it was very important the way you framed it as well, of coming from neo-pragmatism, because he talks about a lot of thinkers from all over the world, and it's probably unique in that he's probably one of the only people that will talk about Black ideas, but is the distinction being mediated by the Western philosophical tradition.
That is true.
And some people might be like, oh, people don't consider the Black ideas or the Black history because they're racist, which I don't know. Yeah, this case by case basis. But the Western philosophical tradition, as a basis, is inadequate in itself to deal with the pressing moment right now, and with the long arc of history of this country. I like the way Jeremiah put it in when he was like, people weren't really sure what to make of the United States and the world in the 70s and 80s, in that great counter-revolution, and the death of King. When we say that the country has never really dealt with the death of King, I think somebody like Cornel West is representative of that, because you felt you had to go outside of the Black radical tradition to look at and examine and deal with what had happened in the country and what to do to move forward, instead of trying to be within the Black radical tradition and advance it forward. I think of it an analogy of like, let the Black radical tradition be the tree, and you can graft on branches from everywhere, and you'll have 1,000 fruits that will bloom. But I don't feel that the Western philosophical tradition is able to do such a thing in this time period, which doesn't discount its usefulness. That's why we're reading Hegel. And especially representative, he was not able to talk about Ukraine. He was not able to talk really about this growing discontent within this country broadly. And so I think that's all the more meaning for us in the work we're doing. So I'm glad to be here with you guys to continue.
Okay, I wanted to also say a few things and then also read some of the comments, because there have been a lot of interesting comments where I think people have been talking also about pragmatism and death and evil. And I feel like there's actually a lot to get out of that. So maybe I'll just start by reading some of the comments, but I also wanted to respond to some of them. So Jake, Todd, Philip Logan, Danny Jacobs, Manesfi, Don DeBar. A lot of people are saying good morning. And then, let's see. Danny says that science for Kant and Hegel means the conditions of possibility, and the fact that, or the point that pragmatists are non-foundational actually goes back to Kant. And so Hegel is making an argument to be, I guess, presuppositionless. And so he's saying that all of these conversations about pragmatism are actually like neo-Kantian, where they're dealing with Kant, but I guess going in a different way, like sort of regressively.
Interesting observation.
Yeah.
Actually, I think I think they're pre-Kant. See, I think, and it's back to what we call empiricism, David Hume. I think if you're talking about neo-pragmatism or pragmatism, it is a return to the English tradition of empiricism.
Yeah.
Kant tries to transcend.
Yeah.
And of course, Hegel does as well. But that's just my observation.
Okay, so Danny had said like he thinks that we can treat all of these different philosophical symptoms of pragmatism, positivism, ontology, and phenomenology as symptoms of the Kantian aftermath. So I think what he's saying is that, yeah, it's an attempt to try to return to basically before Kant, but only because Kant made such like a pivotal contribution to basically
I agree with you.
Or push pragmatism. And so
if I could just say one thing. Indeed, so, but Chomsky does not go back to pre-Kant. I mean, Danny and I might differ on this. I think Chomsky is quintessentially a Kantian. But we in terms of empirical actual research, but we can return to that. I don't want to make a big thing.
Yeah. So then he also says that he points out that we need to consider how all of these philosophies, like even the neo-pragmatism, is symptomatic of historical process, which I think relates to Jeremiah's point about contextualizing Cornel West's, philosophical awakening in the aftermath of the civil rights movement.
Yes.
So related to Hegel treating the truth and the present moment as historically and socially constituted.
Absolutely.
And so as a result, you would think of existentialism too as being a symptom of capitalism, as a collapse of bourgeois society. And yeah, I feel like that's interesting too, because I actually thought that Cornel West, a lot of his fundamental concepts, I think, come more from the theological side of things, the religious part, as opposed to I think a historical sense, if that makes sense.
Can I ask you a question? Nora, you said from a theological?
Yeah, well, because I was also reading a little bit into his biography, and he said he went to college, I guess, when the Black Panther Party was really big, but he said that he didn't want to join them because of his, I guess, religious convictions. And also he wrote, I think his PhD thesis was on Marx, but it was on the ethical dimensions of Marx. And so I feel those were just two sort of interesting tidbits. But to Daryl Waistline Mitchell also says, having met Cornell in 1975 at the Detroit 2 Liberation Theology, Doc's overview of his gigantic intellect is spot on. In 1976, Cornell was ghostwriting for Cone and James Cone, and had not yet published his first book, whose chapter 4 is dedicated to me, as in Daryl, as a polemic against my pro-Stalinism. But he continues, Cornell remains a big man on campus, a title won through hard work, and embraces a doctrine that is the philosophy, theory, and theology of evil. Evil is part of a binary opposed to the goodness of the Godhead, while contradictions are a different construct from a simple binary. Cornell's evil is a material force, timeless and inherent to being, and under all circumstances must be fought, hence the ideology of continuous catastrophe. Biden is more dangerous to humanity, and Trump danger is to unleashing extra-legal terrorist forces domestically. Biden is a constitutional fascist, while Trump is an oligarch fascist. But Biden is clear and present danger. And he says, yes, the middle is collapsing. West is a huge subject, especially on music, but he disagrees and says, tragically, Cornell West holds the sound of Philadelphia higher than Motown, and seems not to give Lee Morgan his just due. But then he continues, in the broad philosophic sense in public policy, Cornell is akin to Chris Hedges on the basis of both doctrines of the meaning of evil as a material force. Cornell's historic criticism of Marx is of the empty Marxist meaning of death, a phrase I still do not comprehend, since as it was mentioned, death unites us all without discrimination. And so hope figures in as the most powerful force driving the human spirit. And I don't know, I just thought that was really interesting, because I do think that in the ways that he mentioned, I guess, like the Dalits or like the Chinese Muslims, and also like his references, I guess, to like xenophobia or like anti-Semitism as like basically a historical constant, I think sort of goes back to this idea of like, oh, eternal evil, like evil will always come. And then it's up to like, I guess, humanity to try to respond to it. But I think, yeah, there's a certain eternal binary in that that's not actually like contradictory in terms of, I think, overcoming or becoming.
Beautiful.
I feel like that's kind of where Hegel is so important. And Danny also had some comments about Sartre, Kant, and like life and death. And so he says, okay, like Kant's dialectic is about giving meaning to life, where I think death is supposed to, I think, illuminate the meaning of life and drive, I guess, like life's struggle. But Danny says that Kant's essay directly takes up the question of death. It drives us to do things that go beyond us for the human species in order to be immortal for this in the species. And then he says that because you act to be remembered or to like play a role in human history, like that's actually, I guess, conquering death. But then he says that this dialectic of life and death like is basically like not existent in the 20th century existentialists, because the society is like completely broken, I guess, with World War II, where I guess like this interplay between life and death becomes shattered. And yeah, and then he says, in other words, the very question of becoming changes the meaning of death in a way that didn't exist in ancient society. For example, Virgil's Aeneid, Aeneid's, that section on Hades. And so I think that was interesting too, because one of the questions that I'd had after the lecture is, why does Cornell West like go so consistently back to the Greeks? Like to the Greeks, and I think even like this thing of like Jesus, where there's a way that you can interpret Jesus's life in exactly, I think, the terms that other people were saying in this conversation, where to love is to die. Where I feel like the more dialectical way of that is what Danny was saying too, about like the meaning of life is to actually like conquer death, where death is coming, but it doesn't have the meaning of death anymore, because you've earned your death, you've actually contributed something to humanity, and because of that, like you can't actually die. Yeah, and so I just think all of that made me think a lot too, because I found the lecture really interesting, and yet I was a little bit sad, because it sort of made me ask the question, like, what actually is the expectation of a public intellectual? Like, what is their responsibility? Because like, what should a public intellectual, I guess, actually demand of their audience or of the people who listen to them? Where is it just, I guess, the feeling that your world has been opened up and that you're curious about many things? and that you feel a sense of, I guess, love or like humanity or whatever? Or is it actually fair or necessary, at least in this moment, for a public intellectual to expose, I guess, like the philosophical foundations that drive life or like the meaning of life?
Could you explain that a little bit more, Nuri, to expose the philosophical foundations?
Yeah, well, because I think it's sort of like when you go to that lecture, what happens next? Like, what is expected of you when you leave?
Absolutely.
Like, when the expectation, because I do think the expectation was like, oh, I want to be like a decent human being who's like a part of this world. But I think the question is, yeah, like on what terms? Like, is it enough to merely feel like, oh, I'm enlightened enough where I can listen to critiques of the Democratic Party? Like, I embrace that. But at the same time, like, I really still believe that the Democratic Party is like better than the Republicans or Trump. And I don't know, because I think what I realized too is that with Noam Chomsky and Cornel West, there are public intellectuals who are on the left, but are they actually revolutionaries?
Yeah, that's
Like, are they public intellectuals or are they revolutionaries?
Yeah.
And so I think at first I was really kind of upset after the lecture because I think I had secretly been hoping for something revolutionary. But then I realized that they don't necessarily declare themselves to be revolutionary. They're just public intellectuals who are on the left. And I feel like our discussion of like neo-pragmatism also helped illuminate like where they would situate themselves. Like, that's where they would situate themselves. Yeah, because I think part of why we're reading Hegel and why we are trying to gain like a philosophical foundation is because we're not just trying to be like intellectuals who speak on a public platform. Like, we're actually trying to, I think, drive deep to the essence of like, one, the American people and how they view the world, but also the ideas that are necessary to continually drive and advance that change. Because I think that's also the difference of how we view the Trump movement, where the Trump movement, in essence, is not just a manifestation of eternal xenophobia or eternal racism. Actually, the Trump movement is, its essence is a historical like becoming of the American people. And yes, like it has certain elements to it, but there's no way that we would, I guess, identify that as the essential like aspect of that movement. And I think that we're able to do that because of our philosophical foundations, because our category is the Black proletariat and not catastrophe. Like, that distinction is what allows us to recognize and view things in the way that we do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then there are like a few more comments. So Philip Logan says Noam Chomsky is also a self-described anarcho-syndicalist. And Don DeBar says, I guess, complete pragmatism is so not appropriate for a world where a large and growing part of human interaction is mediated. And then Jake says, what do you think of the idea that Cornell took a lot of popular radical stances, like being pro-Palestine and saying that King was a pacifist? It seems like that's what was happening, but I could be wrong. And Jake likes the idea of a philosophical nut to crack. And Why Not Learn, I guess, is saying that Cornel West was attacking Afrocentric scholars, but made a truce with Henry Louis Gates.
Say that again. I couldn't. He attacked Afrocentric scholars.
Yeah, but made a truce with Henry Louis Gates. Yeah, but then I think there was another comment somewhere. Maybe I lost it. And then someone said, well, Afrocentric scholars are often frauds. So I feel like that conversation has resolved itself in the comments. And then Emil says, the First Amendment in this country, and in fact, the entire idea of democracy, comes from a higher belief in the capacity of humanity. Yeah, I think that's basically it. Oh yeah, and then Philip Logan says, yeah, like Ethical Dimensions of Marxist Thought is his first book. And so I was curious too about that. Like, I would be interested in looking into that, because I feel like when you take the ethical dimensions of Marxism, I feel like you're sort of trying to prescribe like almost an eternal, like just a fundamental human ethics rather than like a historical ethics. Yeah.
You know, it's so interesting. Just a quick thing. Cornell, as a a theorist of liberal democratic theory. I think because he has Race Matters and he has Democracy Matters, and his argument is very close to about democracy is very close to John Stuart Mill on liberty, on freedom of individual rights. So at that point, he leans towards libertarianism. And somebody mentioned that Noam Chomsky self-defines as a socialist libertarian, which, if you remember, I don't know if anybody remember when Cornell invoked Edmund Burke? Yeah, Edmund Burke. Y'all don't remember that? I don't know, why did I remember that? The conservative liberal, the classic liberal, Edmund Burke would have differed with Thomas Jefferson in that Edmund Burke, would be more liberal, more towards John Locke, hence that the foundation of liberty, the foundation of rights, the measure of all of this and of democracy is how free the individual is. And you all are absolutely right. Our categories are more like those that would emerge, let us say, from Kant or Hegel, in that sense that our categories do not privilege the individual. And so we can see the Indian independence movement as freeing the nation from colonialism in the name of, and this, Shantanu, I hear you completely, in the name of the Indian people who are still evolving to a people as we are in this country. This is a very interesting thing, and I agree with everybody saying this. It does affect how you think based on where you begin. If it is an individualist, a reductionist, atomistic beginning, then the philosophical and theoretical mechanisms to get to the whole are always through the aggregation of individuals. I mean, think about the political practice of the elite, polling data. You will know what people will do based upon what they tell pollsters who call them on the phone. Or, you take, like in this 2024 election, even the discussion of abortion rights and they say the rights of women, but what they're saying is the rights of individual women. Because there are tens of millions of women who cannot access those rights, do not identify with those rights because they cannot see themselves in this bourgeois construction of womanhood. And maybe I'm going out on a limb. There are tens of millions of women who would more easily identify with the category, the proletariat, the Black proletariat, than with the category woman as constructed in this individualist way. I hope I made sense. It's not a given. I'm sorry, Jerry. It is not a given that because you say the rights of women, that all women will just gravitate and march down the street. Rights of women, because they do not identify with womanhood defined, or rights of women defined in these individualist ways. The extension of that, then woman becomes a social identity or construct which includes transgendered women. I mean, but you could see that it all flows from the logic of individual rights and not from the construct of social rights and democracy based upon social rights and the rights of all as a condition for the rights of one. I'm sorry, Jerry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that addresses the question that I had, which is earlier you mentioned that King and the civil rights movement sought a democratic means to a new democracy. And I feel like this is a question which I feel like bears like explanation, like what actually, like what does that really mean? Because like it also reminds me of like the Norman Finkelstein like book too, because I feel like it's one thing to just say like a democratic means to a new democracy, right? But I feel like when you say that, a lot of people may just think that you're talking, as you were saying, about like like the kind of liberal democracy or the rights of individuals, which I think is in some ways like a misinterpretation of like one, the civil rights movement, but also like what, I don't know, like what is the actual task, I guess, because like, and so I don't know. I think one of my general questions, which I don't know if it can be fully answered in like one conversation,
but to understand King, understand his invoking of nonviolence.
Right.
It is nonviolence as a means to an end. Although at the moral ethical level, nonviolence is a social imperative, a moral imperative, if society is something we all wish to advance and preserve. If you want to destroy society, the best way to do it is to say that the only path to radical democratic and revolutionary change is the Civil War armed struggle approach, which then doesn't just pit the masses against the ruling class, but divides the masses. And what King was saying is, we can have a means to democracy, which the end is not just democracy or new democracy, but a new people, a new human being. And that's so obvious in King that I just wonder how so many people always miss it or get it wrong.
Yeah.
Or reduce him to a naive pacifist.
Yeah, because it's also like when you were talking earlier about like the women's rights thing, it reminded me too of like Baldwin when he would have conversations with, I think there's that one, he had like a conversation about like homosexuality and like the gay movement with, I forget what was his name. It was like some white.
Yeah, with the Village Voice.
Yeah, that one. And there's a part when Baldwin is like, I don't really identify as a gay man, I identify as a black man. And I feel like in a superficial way, you could misinterpret that and be like, oh, he's just, it's a question of like choosing which identity preference you have, right? But actually it's a broader like philosophical and then like ideological and political question, because something that we talked about in one of our reading groups earlier this week is part of what distinguishes and is unique about the Black experience and the Black freedom struggle is that it's almost like because you're part of this group, which is in some ways determined by society and determined by the ruling class, but it's like as an individual, the only way that you can see freedom for yourself is actually to seek the freedom of your people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that is the quintessential thing, which like that is the lesson that all Americans can learn from. And like that is the difference also between like one version of democracy, which is the standard one, but then also like what is meant by a new democracy, like a new people. And I feel like that lesson has been, in some ways, like that has been attacked and kind of covered over. But like that is the kind of like what we mean by like the Black proletariat as something representative of like what the American people can become, because it's that kind of orientation that an individual person can have in seeking freedom. Is like you can only do that through seeking freedom for the whole. But I feel like it's something that is kind of like not fully understood, I guess, in this time.
Wait, can people hear me, if that's all right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so actually something I wanted to jump off of what Jeremiah, you were saying around, I think, talking about freedom, talking about how Cornell really, like, I think I didn't realize at the moment, but now having, you know, the presentation document in the beginning about pragmatism, but also how fundamentally opposed it is to even how we're able to use Hegel and how we're always still like seeing all this emancipatory potential and understanding applying Hegel to our understanding of even like the of Black Reconstruction, of the American people, of this moment, a new American people. I think I have so many thoughts because I feel like I'm still kind of synthesizing all of this. But one thing I wanted to say was that as we were trying to make sense, I think at the very beginning, it was so helpful because I also did leave that lecture with a lot of questions. Some of the questions were because I think I saw myself also having changed a lot in the last 4 years because of studying with Free School. I think there was actually a moment where being introduced to Africana studies, Black studies, and university, but not having any other way to engage in this tradition other than through somebody like Cornell West made me realize now, having like studied with the Free School, having a chance to actually think not only things out for myself, but even how compelling something like our understanding of history, of, you know, democracy, not just in liberal bourgeois terms, but even applying it to, just generally feeling like I don't have to, like, we don't have to feel stuck the way Cornell's thinking ultimately on, like, leaves you, you know, takes you to certain new heights if you're like a young person who may not have been able to engage with the Black tradition, the Black radical tradition before. But you can actually advance it and feel like you're part of something. You can actually see just how important ideas are in the emancipation of humanity, but also in the creation of a new American people, which will lead to a new kind of freedom that is very much the birthright or even part of this enduring struggle of all these different American revolutions. I might jump a little bit, but I think it was because when we were trying to make sense of the earlier I think Emily and I, we were kind of like trying to have a little bit of sidebar just to make sure we were understanding everything correctly. I feel like we're all like, we didn't really get all trained in philosophy, but we did remember something, Doc, you had mentioned very, very long time ago when we were, I think, maybe first reading Hegel, that this question around Hegel being pinned by Anglo-American philosophers as like his thinking will naturally lead you to dictatorship, to authoritarianism. But like the whole point is that like the great value that Hegel brings is that he's able to have a unified theory of totalities, of everything. And like, I just remember, Doc, you were like, what is so bad sometimes about totalitarianism? Because totalities are just very important. And I remember kind of cracking up because I feel as if like all our training in like the liberal bourgeois framework, the Anglo-American, the pragmatist, is to say, don't even go there. Don't even think about trying to bring everything together. Like that's what the immediacy thing is. That's what even like casting all of this as like, oh, but the pragmatist tradition thinks in terms of like the ordinary person. How would the ordinary person make sense of this? How does that create any meaning for the ordinary person, or how does the ordinary person create meaning? But actually, like what we're saying in terms of expanding our definitions of freedom as we have been, or even in the sort of the Black proletariat sense, that like freedom is achieved by seeking freedom for your people, is really important, because I think that's where some of the contradictions emerge for, obviously, like maybe even for Cornell West, but even just for people who remain in that definition of like guaranteeing individual rights, or like, I think that's where people might even see free schools' definition of freedom being like, well, like, are we not sacrificing the right of the individual for the right of the collective? How maybe even, I don't know. I'm trying to think of the critiques that maybe free school has endured in the past, but I do think that this is something that ultimately, like, actually this definition of individual freedom, bourgeois freedom, and all of that. I might be just, I don't know, beating a dead horse here, but it is like, it's so limiting. How is that freedom? I mean, and I do think that that's something really important when we, like, I even find that this is helping me understand a lot of other like forces or ideas out there that I feel like they're so incompatible with how free school views the world, but also they are ultimately incompatible, like with how we appreciate, say, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese, but also even the idea of how we're, I think, forming or shaping out the notion of the new American people, and how the new American people will take the Black proletariat as a model for what Americans can become, and that will be something I think really important because of right now what people could what is freedom to mean. I think what is the relationship, I guess, between the individual and the collective, but I think it's really clear for us, but also for many, it's really different and very limiting, and I just hope that that can speak to more people, because one of the questions I also even had coming out of the Cornell West lecture is just, I've mentioned this the folks here, which is just like, that room was so packed full of like also young Black students who I think if they came to free school, they'd maybe also feel like they got this really exciting like synthesis of, you know, the Black radical tradition, but also with like Hegel, but also with so many, you know, we also drink from the fountain of knowledge wherever we can find it. But at the same time, like, we kind of want to work on, but not that we need to work on anything or change what we do. It's just like, I just found that so interesting that Cornell still is so resonant for those young people, those young students, but that they also deserve to have a home if they're willing to learn, they're willing to struggle with all of this and with ideas here, the free school, in a way that I think will help them move forward and not feel so stuck either. Stuck at Penn, stuck at this sort of, you know, conception of themselves at this in this time. Yeah, and really free them if they come. But yeah, that was a lot of thoughts, and yeah, I don't know if I glossed over and made some of those jumps kind of broadly, but that's how I felt coming out of the lecture. I think I actually found myself realizing how much I had grown because of the free school in my thinking, but also, yeah, wanting to see that and yeah, how that can be something others can, you know, that's something we're all working through.
Emily, do you want to go on to the next thing?
String theory?
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think it relates, frankly, I think, you know, because, you know, and I'll be quick with this, because, you know, philosophy is so important at this time, you know, and I think, again, you know, I'm repeating myself, but those who trivialize philosophy are really trivializing the ideological struggle. And to trivialize the ideological struggle is, it says to me that you do not understand how change is brought about. But I was talking to Nanditha and Raju on Tuesday, I think, and because Nanditha interviewed me about Paul Robeson. And in the course of the conversation, I mentioned that I felt that string theory, which I'll explain in a minute, which is, this elite, really hipster thing in physics, in theoretical physics. And I said to Raju and Nanditha that I think that string theory could collapse under its own weight and its inability to explain very much of anything. And Raju said to me that this guy named Peter Woert, Woirt, had just come out with a new book called Not Even Wrong, I think that's the title of it, talking about string theory. And so I went to his blog, and I went to an interview that he did about a year ago with Lex Friedman. In fact, Lex's last name is spelled Fridman. Doesn't have an E in it. And I found the interview very important because this physicist, who is also a mathematician, I think he has 2 PhDs, one in physics and one in mathematics, was coming out full on against string theory. Now, what is string theory? String theory is sometimes referred to as a unified theory of quantum physics and traditional Newtonian and Einstein physics. And they operate, it seems, the two areas of physics operate on different principles. For example, classical physics, which is Newton and Einstein and others, of course, operates on principles of gravity. That gravity is universal. Without gravity, the universe collapses in upon itself. String theory, and we've talked about this before, and we'll come back to it again, tries to deal with the crisis produced by quantum physics, that is subatomic particles that don't behave like large bodies do. And all previous physics has been based upon large bodies before quantum mechanics. One of the things that we said here, when the first time we did the science of logic, is that the philosophical and even theoretical problems of quantum physics have never been resolved, and they were interrupted by one, the rise of Nazism and World War II, and secondly, the Cold War, and probably third, the, I think, untimely death of Albert Einstein, who was fighting for something different than what many of those who are the advocates of string theory do. Now, a unified theory of everything, and quantum physics being really the physics of imagination, maybe I'm going too far, but of infinite abstraction. If the project of physics is to come up with new, more refined, more eloquent mathematical equations to theorize about a world which you're getting further and further from in terms of your theory. Did that make sense where I put that? In other words, you're trying to understand quantum physics which is the physics of particles at the subatom level. You're trying to understand that. But in trying to understand it and how this relates to classical physics, but in trying to understand this, you get further and further and further and further away from empirical reality. Thus, your equations, your mathematical equations, perhaps eloquent, perhaps interesting, perhaps very new and all of that type of thing, don't explain what you're trying to get at. So, for example, the geometry of physics theorizing is that all reality is composed of 4 dimensions, 3 spatial dimensions plus time. String theory, in order to explain reality, theorizes 10 dimensions, 3 spatial dimensions and 7 time dimensions. But there is no empirical references for that. It is abstraction explained through another level of abstraction and another level of abstraction and another level of abstraction. So a very tiny group of thinkers and mathematicians are playing with all of this, and it's gone nowhere. In fact, according to this man, string theory is on the verge of collapse. Now, it came into existence about 40 years ago. So it's had not a long run, but 40 years. And, you know, for people who are into the exotic and the playful, that's all good. And people who like very complicated mathematical equation, it's a beautiful thing. But it has not brought us closer to understanding how these 2 domains of physical theorizing, that is quantum mechanics and classical physics, can be brought together. We just don't know that much more than we did 40 years ago when this theory began. Now, I just want to say a quick thing. Unified theories. I am a proponent of unified theories. I don't particularly like the academic separations of knowledge into disciplines. For example, if you go back in the days, Isaac Newton, you say, well, was he a mathematician or was he a physicist? He would have said he was a philosopher. If you ask Rene Descartes, what are you, a mathematician or a philosopher? He said, I'm a philosopher. And all of the questions of philosophy and mathematics can be addressed simultaneously or something like that. But now we're in this disciplinary thing where mathematicians don't necessarily talk to physicists. But in physics, and this is an irony, because physics was on the cutting edge of a lot of new thinking going back over 100 years ago, is now falling behind mathematics. Mathematics has been more successful in producing unified thinking. For example, uniting algebra and geometry, uniting algebra, geometry, and number theory. So mathematics is far further along. Physics took this crazy route And according to Peter Ward, he says that never in the history of physics has physics taken such a crazy, exotic, and unproductive route as it has over the last 45 years. Now, it's very interesting, as we have talked that before, that what is this period politically?
Right.
And why would such exotic theorizing be so appealing in the academy and among theoretical physicists? Let us think about it for a moment. Now, no string theorist has gotten a Nobel Prize for physics yet, but that don't mean they won't, because they're giving them out now to people that say that particles exist because we become conscious of them, not because they exist. So that's a great leap backward, to put it mildly. And who is to say somebody talking about theoretical physics might get a Nobel Prize? It might be Raju's brother, by the way, which would be interesting. But we are not close. In other words, we're not close to any unified theory in physics. However, take the other side. In social theory, social theorizing, I think if things develop as I would like to see them, we could be on the cusp of a new unified theory of social transformation. You know, when we talk about a Lenin-Du Bois synthesis, it's not just the two individuals, but it is these two bodies of knowledge and these two traditions of thinking about revolutionary transformation. That is an attempt at a unified theory. Now, what makes this unified theory more productive than string theory? Isn't it interesting that all of these high-paid, celebrated physicists have taken physics down a dead-end street, but perhaps we, I say this humbly, operating in the free school, are closer to a real theoretical breakthrough, a real unified theory, or the potential of it in social theorizing. How could we perhaps or potentially do what all of these mathematicians and academic physicists have not done? Well, I think just in terms of the unified theory that we're talking about, it is not, it does not, how would I say it? It does not base its success or not, or failure, upon abstraction without empirical reference. That is the importance, in particular, of Black Reconstruction in America. Both theory and a huge body of empirical evidence. Multiple forms of empirical evidence. It is not a predisposition towards universal abstraction, but towards the concrete universal. In a sense, in a very interesting sense, and we could explore this, what Hegel talked about as the notion, with the capital N. And so, yeah, I'll just stop there, because it very much relates. If when we get a chance to look at the table of contents of Hegel's Science of Logic, again, a work in progress, an incomplete work, incomplete in the sense that, well, no one, and he, and Hegel in particular, didn't have time to complete it. He dies in 1830. He starts work on this, I think, in about 1810, 1812. So it's a 20-year work in progress. The other side of it is that if you look at the table of contents, he explores various areas of science, including calculus, differential and integral calculus, physics, in this case, Newtonian physics, I think biology, or certainly chemistry. And what he is trying to show is that rather than logics of identity or syllogistic logic, all matter exists as dialectical logic. And he's saying that if you look at all of these sciences, whether they're practitioners and the experimenters in these fields realized it, but what they are affirming is that all things exist as a negation of negation, or in constant motion and change. So again, whether people want to do it or not, to understand the crisis of theoretical physics, it is helpful to deploy Hegel's Science of Logic. That's all I wanted to say about that.
Yeah, I wish I had more to comment on
Don't
string.
worry about. We'll be coming back to it. It's just to say that everything that goes on in science does not lead to productive and creative outcomes and greater knowledge. A lot of science has, especially theoretical science and theoretical physics, has become so consumed with abstraction, and has thus led a good part of science and the scientific community into a dead end. It's kind of what you all thought about Cornell.
Yes.
Where does this lead us? What is to be done? Is this just abstraction and discourse for its own sake? And are we headed down, or some of us headed down a path that's a dead end, philosophically and socially, social-politically? And the same has occurred in science. And, the parallel to what goes on in string theory or theoretical physics is Foucault's theory of reason, of rationality, and of institutions and hierarchies, by the way. So we've endured. This is very interesting, I would say. We as in we in the West have endured almost a 50-year period where science, social theorizing, and philosophy have more than not led us down dead ends rather than forward towards emancipation. That is the point I'm trying to make. We return to Hegel from Black Reconstruction. That is a novel intersection.
Yeah.
Few have even thought it possible to unite the science of logic and Black Reconstruction in America, or for that matter, Hegel's phenomenology of mind and Du Bois's writings, for example, in Souls of Black Folk. I mean, so it is towards a unified theory. It is towards a larger, holistic understanding of the processes of social transformation. And it is because, and this is where categories are very important, I think. And I think you cannot do very much without them. Pragmatism is rejecting categorical thinking or thinking through mediation. It rejects it. It is the immediate that is the sole concern. Meaning comes from outside of that experience. Some people would say that meaning comes from Christianity. Others would say it comes from culture, i.e. the blues. You know what I'm saying? You give meaning to experience through something external to the experience itself. That's where you get the idea of habit or habituation. It is a culture, this is the argument, it is a cultural habit to connect certain experiences in certain ways. Americans would do it one way, Germans might do it another way, Chinese might do it another way. But there is nothing implicit to the process of knowing that establishes conditions of meaning for empirical experience. When Hegel talks about mediation, he is talking about that which comes before experience. And I could say more about that in terms of Noam Chomsky as well. But this is why we return to science of logic, not in a, dropping to our knees and, sending up hosannas and hallelujahs to the great Hegel. We're not doing that. It is looking at, because, again, Du Bois is more of a Hegelian than he is a Lockean or John Stuart Mill's thinker. And therefore Du Bois is often smeared as being a totalitarian, authoritarian, and anti-democratic. That's part of the rejection of him, that he thinks more in Kantian and Hegelian ways than he does in English and US pragmatist ways. So I'll just stop there.
Yeah, that makes me think about how we read through Black Reconstruction, because we, I guess, essentially, finished it in a way. Didn't finish it page by page, but then we're getting back to the doctrine of being in Hegel.
Yeah.
I just think that's interesting because it is true that in Black Reconstruction, there, Du Bois is writing as a person who's recording history, or almost setting history right, saying that this is what happened during the period of 1860 to 1880. but then he's also talking to like what it would be like his students or like the future, as well as like, the, schools of history and thought that are competing with how he can even write Black Reconstruction, and his interjection that the Black proletariat is like the central anchor in which the that period moved, and also like the struggle for freedom and for the world depends upon, is also like a philosophical as well as like a historical, like in what you're saying, like it's it's empiricist, like it has evidence to back it up as to why that's even why this argument that Du Bois is actually making is actual fact, instead of just like a theory or some kind of abstract debate to have around.
Yeah.
But then like it makes me think of like, well, it does seem like we have grown a lot since we came back to Hegel, and like we're able to think about Hegel in like a concrete way, like we're able to kind of see what
That's
Hegel
a
is
very
saying.
important. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Very important.
No, but I because I'm feeling kind of like it is actually important, the distinctions that you're making about why we're going back to Hegel and what does Du Bois even mean, not solely just as a revolutionary thinker for our times, which is actually almost key to even opening up the discussion about Du Bois, but like how is it that we can create a new analysis, a new framework, new way of thinking that is revolutionary, that also asks or helps answer the question that young people are facing today. Like, in what way do we act in a society which is in transition, like a country that is going through so much of a crisis and that needs a new way of thinking about the crisis that we're in, to contextualize the crisis that we're in, and where to even go. Like, who do I go to if not King or Du Bois in this crisis? Like, how do we understand Trump? How do we understand Kennedy? How do we understand deindustrialization? How do we understand that period that also Cornel West struggled to understand, but also doesn't fully understand, meaning the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, that period which the civil rights movement also had, or like the struggle for freedom had a pushback. There was a pushback. And what does it mean to see Russia and China? And in what context do we see it as? What does Stalinism mean? And how is that even relevant to the conversation of philosophy? Meaning, like, are we for, or like, do we agree that Trump is a fascist? Or is Trump significant because of the moment that is also in process of developing? Like, what's actually making Trump significant for our time, for the people in America, and so on? Because what does fascism mean? Who's telling you this, and why? And I think that all are things that we've discussed and are working out in the free school because of like what we're reading and so on. But like Du Bois also set us in a certain historical moment, and set us understanding even King better, or like the civil rights movement better. Like, what are the democratic demands that we that the civil rights movement faced, and what are we now to ask for as a democratic demand for the new American people? And then also with Hegel, it's still again like that same question of like, well, what is the revolutionary philosophy, the way to think out this new human being, what we say by reading like Baldwin is also significant. Like, for what do we struggle for our purpose in life? Like, is the purpose to kind of have a dead end life, or is it the purpose to earn our death? And how do we see that? That's all kind of wrapped up back into this conversation that we're trying to work out, which is this new revolutionary synthesis that helps us all think about the moment that we're in now. So I thought it was
This is so very important.
Oh man, this is the good stuff indeed, man. This is the good.
Yo, enthusiasm is crazy.
When you guys talk about string theory and talk about these like higher dimensions and what that really means, I really like the way you anchor it in terms of verifiable hypotheses that make it real, and at the same time, the way that you order and make sense of your physical reality should be and can be the way that you make sense of the movement of history and human beings. That's how I try to connect it and make it real without getting too deep and caught up in the technical details, because that stuff is stimulating for me, man. It's better than coffee.
Yeah.
And along that vein, without cutting me off if I'm getting too deep, the way that I like try to make sense of like string theory is like this little this thought experiment that I've heard about before, where like imagine you're a two-dimensional being, and you can only move along on a piece of paper, but you live in a three-dimensional world. How would you make sense of that? Because you can only look, forward, backward, side to side. You can't look up and down. How would you make sense of that universe if there are things out there that you can't necessarily directly perceive or measure, but nonetheless impact you? Is it still real, and can you grasp it? I try to make it a human question as well, as there are things that you don't necessarily exactly know about people or can know, but it still affects you. So yeah, I'm looking forward to doing more. Yeah.
I mean, it would be harder to understand the world that you can't comprehend if your philosophy doesn't allow you to comprehend
That's right.
it.
That's right. Right. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, but that's true.
Absolutely
That's what
right.
you're pointing out with the pragmatism versus Hegel, which is like that. Like it's not. There needs to be mediation because you have to believe in the human being to be able to think for themselves. Like the person isn't just like a object that is kind of like innate, inanimate, and like non-movable. But how can you believe that something ever really is when you interact with it? Because then what actually moves anything? Like what is the thing that pushes anything forward?
Absolutely.
Like chance. These other questions are still on the table when you bring that up.
But all of this that we're talking about, I think, gives meaning to the idea that philosophy is politics and ideology by the means. I mean, politics and ideology, some people would say when it comes to string theory, you're talking about sociology of the scientist. No, we're talking about the politics of the time. And I don't think it is just small shit that string theory emerges in the 1980s when we're looking at the undoing of the Soviet Union and yada, 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 and the meaning for that. Because then it is a return to subjectivism, and the real is the me. The real is the me. And why is it that at the same time that you have the rise of string theory, you have the rise of deconstruction and postmodernist theories anchored upon people like Foucault and maybe Jacques Derrida? And why is it, and this is so interesting, that pragmatism in this neo-pragmatist form emerges at the same exact time? And why is it that, at least from our observation, all of this is now in a deep crisis, a crisis of their existence as explanatory, philosophical, and natural science theories? That's what Peter Ward is saying. String theory is on the verge of collapse because it's going further and further towards abstraction and further away from the world. Well, what do we see in neo-pragmatism? Or forms of existentialism or theological existentialism, religious existentialism, a further retreat from humanity, from the world, and this kind of dogma that people cannot change.
Right.
You know, that the die has been cast, and we're looking at a great human catastrophe, either climate catastrophe or nuclear catastrophe. But they never tell you, well, what could we do to prevent both? What is the role of the human? Is it just freedom from? Is that what we're condemned to in this moment of catastrophe? Or are we upholding freedom to? That is the moral choice. There is no moral choice based upon retreat from. The moral choice is to run to the problem, to run to the people, to engage with the people. That's the moral choice. You know, and it is Paul Robeson all over again. Paul Robeson, run to the people. Freedom to change the world, not freedom from the world. Oh, this is, and it's. I know I'm talking a lot. Look, it's in a sense. Let me set it up: Robeson or the abyss. Either we live like Robeson, or there is no future for us. We do face moral death, which is the same as non-being. Physical death is easier compared to the death by 1,000 cuts. That is a life of moral death. You die a little bit every minute of your damn life. You're confused, you're lost, you turned out. You know, you looked at a lot of television, a lot of sports, talked a lot of shit. You know what I'm saying? Even string theory. Now is the reckoning. What do you do? This is the question. You've had it wrong, let us say for 50 years, maybe more, but let's say 50 years with the theories that we're talking about. You had it wrong. Let me just say this. Richard Rorty, to his great credit, he writes the book, Achieving Our Country. This is a sentence, a phrase from Baldwin. And what he argues, and this is in the 2000s, is that the intellectual has left the people and gone for themselves. That is the freedom from. Most bourgeois intellectuals define freedom as freedom from the people. Freedom to do my thing. Freedom to be rich. Freedom not to criticize the powers that be. In a revolutionary sense, I'm talking about for revolutionaries, revolutionary morality always carries with it risk. Sometimes you take a calculated risk. Nobody knows where Trump is ultimately going to land, but it looks like he is getting closer to the people. And then you bring Robert F. Kennedy Jr. into the mix. I mean, from a revolutionary standpoint, I'm about ready to sing "Oh Happy Days," with James Cleveland and them, or to sing gospel or start clapping and shouting. I mean, there is something good news about this. because it does, and I agree with Jerry. I agree with your poem so much on this. We look like we're in the throes of an awakening, a beginning,
Yeah.
you know, a newness. The old is dying, but we do not have to face a catastrophe. We could face the beginning of a newness. And that's why the deployment of King and all of that is so valuable and useful.
Yeah, it also makes me think of if you're thinking in terms of like historical time event categories, why did Du Bois use the crisis? Why did Du Bois focus on the crisis rather than naming his journal the catastrophe or something like that?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
The crisis implies, yeah, like an opening. And an opening means, yeah, that you go to the people rather than like just being like, oh, everything is catastrophe, therefore we'll just try to like make the best that we can out of like when in a situation that is overall just really bad. And I feel like that's the way that we operate too, is we see the crisis and we see the opening and the opportunity. And yeah, I don't know, I was just thinking about that as just like ways that you understand the moment that you're in. But yeah.
Do we have any more comments before we do our reading of Science of Logic?
Yeah, I can read some. So this is more just going to some of the parts that respond to what we were talking about. So Danny Jacobs earlier had said that that individual rights are also social rights. And so I think he was responding to an earlier part where he said, the rights of one are also the condition for the rights of all. Wasn't this also King's point that if you are not free, then I'm not free? And that the antinomy, the posing again, like the opposing of individual versus collective is what is posited by neoliberals. For example, negative versus positive liberty. This would be a regression, something below Kant and Hegel. Stephen Palmieri says, the concept and practice of social responsibility manifests itself in a collective struggle for working class consciousness. And then Danny Jacobs also added, totalitarianism collapses the totality. The parts need to be parts for the whole to be a whole. And then also adds that he asks, is string theory a quote unquote bad infinity, referencing Hegel? I don't know what part of Hegel that's referencing.
Yeah.
And then he also adds that
he said a bad infinity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think, yeah, a debasement of the concept infinitude, because in Hegel, even infinity is bounded. So it is not just infinity, you know, endless infinity, infinity, and that's, we're going to get to this, the Hegelian concept of the infinite. Is the infinite ever separated from the finite? Is the infinite itself even bounded? And this is, if I might say, this is the Achilles heel of string theory, because if you talk about unbounded infinitude, you're apt to explain it, quote unquote. You have to go to further and further and further levels of abstraction, to the point where you're no longer talking about the world, you're talking about abstractions.
And then Danny also adds that Kant's three critiques get turned into epistemology, ethics, and aesthetics by academia, and that this falls below Kant's view that they were all sides of the same totality.
It's very interesting.
And the
Yes.
separation into atomistic disciplines, where you have philosophy on one side over here, art on the other side over there, is a symptom of capitalism's disintegration of the social dialectic. The division, as Marx wittily said, seems to be the result of books rather than the books actually reflecting social life. And then Hegel has a whole category called just quote unquote life. Philip Logan also said that the Japanese Communist Party made a decision during the 1940s and rejected the Maoist line in favor of a general strike to achieve a revolutionary course for socialism in Japan, and that professional academic specialization is structurally hostile to unified theoretical discourses.
Yeah.
And then BK on YouTube says that Eddie's thought experiment sounds like Michio Kaku's fish in a bowl analogy.
His what? Michio Kaku's what?
It has an analogy of a fish and a goldfish in a fishbowl, but I don't know what the actual analogy is. Then Danny also adds there's a distinction between pictorial thinking in 3 dimensions versus intelligibility. So 10 dimensions may be intelligible, but it's not like visually. It's not visual.
And that's. Oh, I'm sorry. Forgive me.
No.
I agree with Danny on that, and that's part of the problem too.
Yeah. And then he also.
How do you use 10 dimensions in a world where we only experience 4 dimensions? 3 spatial and 1 time, 1 temporal.
Right.
But I'm sorry.
No. And then Danny also says, quote, and he gives a quote from Richard Rorty that goes, "My sense of the holy, insofar as I have one, is bound up with the hope that someday, any millennium now, my remote descendants will live in a global civilization in which love is pretty much the only law."
That's Richard Rorty.
Yeah.
Wow. And what year was that?
I don't. Maybe Danny could provide the year.
Yeah, that's very important because. Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. But that towards the end of his life, when he's engaging with Baldwin's thinking.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then BK has some suggestions of things that could be worth looking into, including Gabriel Oyibo's Grand Unified Theorem and also the Resonance Science Foundation, as well as Morals for the 21st Century, in which the author John Baines describes his thesis of a quote-unquote moral physics.
Wow.
But yeah. Those were the comments. And then Sophie says that she likes Danny's quotes.
Sophie, do you know what year that quote was? Okay.
Cool.
So Emily, think we could do a little bit of reading before 2 o'clock?
Definitely.
And let me show you where could the paragraph at least, could you see what it is in that? See the paragraph, the beginning is logical. This is still in the doctrine of being.
Wait, the beginning is logical?
Yes.
Wait, no, I'm trying to find it.
Yeah.
You were so excited though. Hold on. Wait, this is still in
Being, yeah, doctrine of being.
The doctrine of being.
in the beginning, or how?
Yeah. Now, where did we end? We ended somewhere around here. Here we have only
we ended at it must be admitted that it is an essential consideration, one which will be found elaborated again within the logic itself, that progression is a retreat to the ground.
Yeah, I
Okay.
remember that.
Okay, but isn't that right before the parent? Wait, hold on.
Where mark are you at? No remarks. Oh, he's at a page right after the first page of the where does science begin?
Where does science begin? Hold on.
That's the beginning of the chapter, then the second page of it.
Wait.
Probably because we have different translations, you know.
Yeah.
Wait. Oh, a beginning is logical in that it is to be made in the element of a free, self-contained thought.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
Oh, okay, so back to the beginning of the chapter.
Yeah, we went to the beginning of the chapter.
Okay, cool.
We haven't read that yet, have we?
We did.
We did.
We read up into.
We read until on my version it's page 49 when he talks about progression is a retreat to the ground. To the
Yes. Of the entire science.
Yeah, that's what we read into.
Yeah.
But we can read again.
Okay. Could we just do this 2 paragraphs here,
Cool.
and then maybe we could leap over to that?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Because
share my screen then.
Because it's interesting where he talks about the beginning, and remember, in the beginning of today, we talked about where you begin can say a lot about how you're going to proceed and where you're going to end up.
Yeah.
And where he begins is the beginning is logical. This is what I just, or again, pure thought or abstraction. Okay. Now, this is not Du Bois, this is Hegel. Okay, let's see how it works. Yeah. Okay, you're
Mhm. A beginning is logical in that it is to be made in the element of a free, self-contained thought in pure knowledge. It is thereby mediated, for pure knowledge is the ultimate and absolute truth of consciousness. We said in the introduction that the phenomenology of spirit is the science of consciousness, its exposition. That consciousness has the concept of science, that is, pure knowledge, for its result.
read that one more time, that sentence right there.
We said in the introduction that the phenomenology of spirit is the science of consciousness, its exposition. That consciousness has the concept of science, that is, pure knowledge, for its result.
Okay. Pure knowledge, yeah. Abstraction, that's what he's saying.
Mm-hmm.
When he says pure knowledge, he's talking about abstract knowledge as its result. Let's see how he does this.
To this extent, logic has for its presupposition the science of spirit in its appearance.
Okay, science of spirit, science of mind, science of consciousness. Okay, all right.
In its appearance, a science which contains the necessity and therefore demonstrates the truth of the standpoint, which is pure knowledge and of its mediation.
Okay.
In this science of spirit, in its appearance, the beginning is made from empirical, sensuous consciousness. And it is this consciousness which is immediate knowledge in the strict sense. There, in this science, is where its nature is discussed.
Okay, very important. Remember, the immediate is the sensuous feeling. All of that knowledge that we get through our hearing, seeing, smelling, touching, yada, 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 yada. It is immediate knowledge. He also refers to that as appearances. Again, I wish to make a distinction here. Hegel is trying to say we can go where Kant said we couldn't go. Kant said we can only know phenomenon as they are mediated through certain concepts. A whole world of essences known, which Kant called noumena, Noumena, was beyond knowledge. Hegel is making a point, I think, and I'm certain of this, that we can know essences. And he's frankly using much of Kant to make his argument. Let's see how he does this.
Any other consciousness, such as faith in divine truths, inner experience, knowledge through inner revelation, etc., proves upon cursory reflection to be very ill-suited as an instance of immediate knowledge. Okay. Oh, okay, I see what he's saying. In the said treatise, immediate consciousness is also that which, in the science, comes first and immediately, and is therefore a presupposition. But in logic, the presupposition is what has proved itself to be the result of that preceding consideration, namely the idea as pure knowledge.
Okay, watch this.
Logic is the pure science, that is, pure knowledge in the full compass of its development.
Okay, knowledge before experience.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Knowledge before, which are the categories of knowledge. Okay, again, remember, pragmatism attacks the notion of thinking through categories. Pragmatism, and indeed most existentialism, is based or remains at the level of the immediate, the experiential, and even the psychological, not what Hegel here is calling the abstract or the logical. I just wanted to say.
But in that result, the idea has the determination of a certainty that has become truth. It is a certainty which, on the one hand, no longer stands over and against a subject matter confronting it externally, but has interiorized it, is knowingly aware that the subject matter is itself, and, on the other hand, has relinquished any knowledge of itself that would oppose it to objectivity and would reduce the latter to a nothing. It has externalized the subjectivity and is at one with its externalization.
Yeah. Don't get miffed. I mean,
Okay.
we can read this again. It's Hegel writing, and I guess Hegel writing and the translator translating. But what he is saying, he's talking about how we come to know and the what is necessary to know the world. He is saying that the categories of knowledge, the pure science, as he calls it, is not external to experience or sensuous experience. It is internal. It is organic to it itself.
Right.
What Hegel is saying, and this is, I think, true, that even as we experience the world, that experience, whether we admit it or not, is already mediated by, in the concepts, already by space and time. In the case of geometry, is already mediated by 4 dimensions, 3 spatial dimensions and time. You see what I'm saying? We act in the world. Whether we know it philosophically or logically, we act in the world in a way that we don't act like the only thing that matters or the only thing that counts for us knowing is immediate experience. We act in the world as though the world is all that we are thinking through categories. And that's why it's so difficult for me to understand what are the pragmatists saying? Okay, you make a philosophical argument, but that's not the way we live. Okay?
Yeah.
If that makes sense. I hope.
Now, starting with this determination of pure knowledge, all that we have to do to ensure that the beginning will remain imminent to the science,
immediate,
to the science of this knowledge is to consider, or rather setting aside every reflection, simply to take up what is there before us. Pure knowledge, thus withdrawn into this unity, has sublated every reference to an other and to mediation.
Okay, let's get certain terms.
Mhm.
Sublated means negation.
Mhm.
Every reference to an other and to mediation. You know, pure knowledge thus withdrawn into this unity has sublated every reference to an other and to mediation. And just read the rest of this.
Okay. It is without distinctions, and as thus distinctionless, it ceases to be knowledge. What we have before us is only simple immediacy. Simple immediacy is itself an expression of reflection. It refers to the distinction from what is mediated. The true expression of this simple immediacy is therefore pure being. Just as pure knowledge should mean nothing but knowledge as such, so also pure being should mean nothing but being in general, being and nothing else, without further determination and filling.
Okay. Please forgive me. I mean, I know how I want to help get us through this text. This is a little difficult for me. I'm trying to figure out what he's saying. You have to realize that so much is unique to him and his time, and the debates and discussions that were going on. But let's keep going because I think he reaches a conclusion.
Yeah. Being is what makes the beginning here. It is presented indeed as originating through mediation, but a mediation which at the same time sublates itself, and the presupposition is of a pure knowledge, which is the result of finite knowledge, of consciousness. But if no presupposition is to be made, if the beginning is itself to be taken immediately, then the only determination of this beginning is that it is to be the beginning of logic, of thought as such. There is only present the resolve, which can also be viewed as arbitrary, of considering thinking as such. The beginning must then be absolute, or what means the same here, must be an abstract beginning. And so, there is nothing that it may presuppose, must not be mediated by anything or have a ground, and ought to be rather itself the ground of the entire science. It must therefore be simply an immediacy, or rather only immediacy itself. Just as it cannot have any determination with respect to another, so too it cannot have any within. It cannot have any content, for any content would entail distinction and the reference of distinct moments to each other, and hence a mediation. The beginning is therefore pure being.
Okay, and if I might just say, this is him in a certain sense referencing Aristotle, that all things, if we are to know things, we must first know them in their pure forms. That is, if we are to know a chair, we must know chairness. If we are to know a tree, treeness. And Aristotle, I think his contribution is categorical thinking. To know is to know things in their pure being. You know what I'm saying? The experience of them is just that, an experience of pure being. Does that make sense? If it doesn't, please show me. Does that make sense, Emily? See, this is in another way, you know, a lot of this, and this is the great value of what Marx does and what Engels does, because they refine some of the language and some of the uncertainties in the language used by Hegel. Okay, Lenin's notebooks on Hegel's Science of Logic further attempts to clarify these problems. Now, for Marx and for Lenin, but certainly for Marx, the question here is the unity between the abstract and the concrete. The abstract are the pure categories, pure being. Mm-hmm. That is the level of abstraction. The abstraction, and I'm not certain how Hegel in the end works this all out, but the abstraction, we know the concrete through the abstraction, or through the unity of the abstract and the concrete. I want to say other things, but I should shut my mouth. But I would keep in mind that immediacy is more the concrete. The mediate is the abstract. Now, but in actual thinking, in actual knowing, in even actual science, the two do not exist separate. The two are inextricably bound together. So we think in both abstract and concrete terms at the same fucking time.
Yeah.
And that's what is so interesting about human thought.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And don't get me started on AI and that bullshit. Because, see, AI is predicated upon the illusion of pure thought, of pure reason, of pure intelligence. And I think the assumption that knowledge and intelligence exists, the highest form of knowledge is pure abstract knowledge. This is where string theory is effed up so bad. What Hegel is saying, that knowledge and science always proceed as a unity of the immediate and the mediate, mm-hmm. the concrete and the abstract. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yes. Yes. Hence, you know, I think dialectics is such a more beautiful form of logic. You see, when Kant uses, when Hegel uses the word sublation, it is the same when we use the concept negation. Mm-hmm. Or, see, and negation is a new unity in waiting.
Interesting.
A negation is a new unity.
In waiting?
In waiting, in becoming.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
See, there's never, and this is where I think analytic philosophy, a la, let us say, Bertrand Russell, or Alfred North Whitehead, or Ludwig Wittgenstein, or a whole number of others that come after them. Analytic in the sense of analysis as opposed to synthesis. When a person says, I'm an analytical philosopher, you say, aha, now I dig where you're coming from. You want to break things down into their smallest parts. And that to know that, and hence, because things don't exist in that way, to know them is to only know them in the abstract form. Let me give another example. This is hugely significant, I feel. Can the current state of theoretical physics lead to anything but abstraction after abstraction after abstraction? Can artificial intelligence show us reasoning that can only lead to further and further abstraction? A lot of people say, no, we're going to download the entire internet and then see if we can put algorithms together that will write Shakespeare's Macbeth. Hey, look, at a certain point, this AI discourse gets so crazy that, I mean, it's only, you have to put it on the stage as comedy act, a la, Dave Chappelle or something. It's crazy. It doesn't. And what Hegel is showing is that we reason dialectically. It is organic to reasoning. Just like, well, I won't go. How could I say it again? That is the beauty, I think, of what he is doing. That is the beauty of what he is doing. And I think what we're seeing already in this first part of this part is how he's beginning to put it together. I don't know, maybe somebody has something to say.
Oh,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
This may be a bit of a crass question, but like when he's talking about beginnings here, is he just trying to work out, like, he's like, okay, I'm gonna examine logic and thought and like a science of thought and a science of logic, and so this may be a gross misinterpretation, but like, is he just trying to work out like where to start from?
Well, this is very important. And what he's saying, see, that's why he keeps referencing, or he referenced several times, the phenomenology of mind, phenomenology of spirit, his first major work, because he is saying that indeed we do begin. He said it appears that we start with the immediate.
Right.
But if you look more deeply at the way we think, we are already thinking in the immediate and mediate terms. We are already thinking in abstract and concrete terms. And in fact, this is a moving thing.
Right.
We're always, see, the human mind, according to Hegel and Kant, first of all, they marveled at human thought, what it could do. And see this idea that it does not have to be like the British empiricists argued, the experience or the concept, the notion. Hegel says, we're always thinking through categories and experience and categories. You know what I'm saying? And in the sense of now science as theoretical physics, let us say, what does science, and I think I agree with Hegel's approach to science. You need a scaffolding that is science, that deals not because this is the real necessarily, but because we need to clarify our categories. For example, in the free school, we talk about the Black proletariat. We haven't worked it all out. We don't have it all right. I don't know that anybody does. But as a category of thinking about the class conflict, but that category separated from the actual experience, let us say, of the class struggle in the United States, of the revolutionary process in the United States. The experience and the category. Now, science, you could say, is a step back from the way we actually think. But scientific thinking is not all that unusual, because we're already thinking using categories. We know how to do it because that's the way we think. So this idea, oh, you can't teach certain people science because they're not, bullshit.
It is.
They can know it because they're already doing it. Guys say, well, oh, I can't do math. I did bad in math. No, you didn't do bad in math. You had a bad math teacher that didn't know math. We already think in these dialectical ways. It is already going on. Now, I'm back to string theory. People say, well, you're whipping a dead horse. That horse needs to be whooped. It really does, because it done got us in some bullshit. Hey, Paul, but tell Raju, we beating that horse, man. You know where I'm coming from. I won't go any further. But string theory, I think, according to Peter Wurst, and I think he's on it, has led us down the primrose path of unnatural thinking, of thinking that, really a way of thinking that people who are, frankly, in terms of thinking, are broken, who are alienated and cut off. We already think in dialectical ways. And that's the beauty of the human intellect.
Yeah, that's interesting. No, that's interesting that you say that, because like the philosophy being the science of sciences.
Yeah.
And I from also what I'm understanding, the beginning is therefore pure being, like to think about.
Yeah, pure thought.
Pure thought, like
the beginning of this. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know.
No, go ahead.
No. See, and the question is beginning of what? Beginning of a science of sciences. So we're already endowed with categories of thought. A lot of times, science is a further refinement of categories based upon new experiences, based upon new experiments. But always in science and in thought, there is the pre-experiential, the pre-experimental, you know? See, some people in science try to say the experiment is everything. We got an atom collider, you know what I'm saying? That could do something that the previous one in 1980 couldn't do. So that means we should be able to do greater experiments. And if we can do better experiments, we will come closer to the truth. What Kant and Hegel say, that first of all, you have to pay attention to the pre-experimental. So just to go in there and an atom crusher, oh my God, look what I did. You know, and then somebody come back and say, you ain't did that much, money. Chill. Because you have to pay attention to the pre-experimental, what Kant calls the a priori, before the experiment. before the experiment. Now that's in the science of logic, philosophy of logic. See, we don't need to get the two confused, but I'm just saying all people are capable of thinking in abstraction because they do it all the damn time.
Yeah.
You know, people like anthropologists will go to remote areas of the Amazon or remote areas of Africa and say, well, they only think in terms of their immediate experience. How the fuck you know that? You don't even speak them people's language. You dig where I'm coming from? All of us think in immediate and mediated ways. You know, and there is some indication that, quote, primitive people, untouched by, quote, modern civilization and all the distractions, think better in abstract ways than modern people do. There is evidence that modern science has obscured more than it's clarified. And again, I say string theory and a lot of the discourse around AI obscures more than it clarifies. So this is where I think Hegel is just, I consider it to be, you know, just beautiful and magnificent, although he's not a great writer.
It's not bad.
He's not bad, okay. or he has bad translators.
I should probably get to work. I don't want to leave. But
Yeah, I know you got to go. You got to go. Well, Serafina has to go. She has to go. But hey, listen, we're going to pick up. I think we've come away a certain length. I think things are becoming clearer. And I think that if we can have more examples, for example, from string theory, from geometry, even from biology and other fields, you know, to show exactly how this works. And of course, from sociology and history, how this works in these fields. And the other thing, I just wanted to say this, you get the wrong categories, you know, because in science and in theory and philosophy, more refined categories, at least what we think of more refined categories, are abstracted from our normal thinking. So we get a more refined abstraction. You know what I'm saying? A lot of people get comfortable with the refined abstraction, can't get back to the real. You know, you ever see that kind of person walking around? You say, damn, brother, you done blew your wig. You say, yeah, man, I'm caught up in abstraction. But I thought I was making a joke.
It was funny.
What's can't get anybody, don't get caught up in too much abstraction. But I'm going to show you an abstraction that was wrongly appropriated from historical experience, settler colonialism. That is an example of a category that is based upon limited empirical knowledge and in fact obscures and distorts empirical reality. This is what Peter Ward, and I would encourage people, if you don't have time to look at the whole interview, go to his blog. He is kicking harder on his blog than in this interview. And he's literally saying that string theory was a catastrophe for physics, unlike anything that had been seen in the history of physics. And that he goes further, at least in this interview at the end, and to consider how this could have happened, they then say we have to look at the sociology of knowledge, which is the way I understand what they're trying to say. You have to look at the ideological conditions that produced it. Why this? Why this? I mean, you see, again, the talk of a 10-dimensional reality, when in fact, empirically, we only have 4 dimensions. So you create a fiction to explain reality. Very similar to settler colonialism, a fiction to explain reality. So to explain settler colonialism or string theory, you can't look at them purely based upon the ideas that they generate. You have to look at other, what we call externalities, things external to the theories, and that is the ideological and political moments, what some people call the sociology of knowledge. This is where we're at. And hence, this is not, I don't think this is so much in Hegel. Hence, you must, in knowing science and theories and all that, you must also understand the moment that they're produced in. The moment that they're produced in. And do they reflect more the political moment than scientific theory? Isn't that interesting? String theory might be a way of mathematicians and theoretical physicists explaining the political moment than explaining particle physics.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I know we're supposed to finish soon, but the point you just made about the question is it more about the political moment, or is it more about the political moment or the science itself? Like, I feel like that was basically, I feel like you just defined my whole course I had to take as my capstone in college, because I was like, my major was basically science, biology, and society, and I had to like examine essentially the meaning of science and society and stuff. But I realize that now that was what my class was trying to teach me, and I just didn't get it because it wasn't being taught the way you would have taught it. But like, even for example, Einstein, like what you said earlier, Doc, about what we're doing when we even involve quantum mechanics, and then also talk about art or talk about Black Reconstruction. What we're doing in free school is attempting to create a new unified theory of social transformation, like a new unified theory, versus like, or for example, Einstein would define himself as a philosopher.
Yes. Newton defined himself as a philosopher.
Oh yeah, so my class started out with Newton, actually.
Mm-hmm.
But anyways, I just wanted to say that I thought that was really clarifying.
No, it's very important, Emily, because, you know, in so doing, this striving for a holistic understanding of knowledge. You know, I can't understand, and it's too late in the day for me to even try to take a whole bunch of math courses to understand what these mathematicians are doing with string theory. And it's not even theory anymore as it is mathematical reasoning, mathematical equations, et cetera, from this Olympic heights, they hope, Olympian heights, they hope to look down and then explain the real world. But then the question is to explain them. In other words, you are not above, as a scientist, as a theorist of science, you are not above the thinking categorically or thinking critically. I mean, we can think. It's not just you explaining the world, but then somebody has to explain you. And this is what Peter Wood is trying to get to. How did it occur? And he says the first time in modern philosophy and physical theory that such a theory has misled science so far away from reality as to turn it into a delusional and science fiction enterprise. How did that happen? Which then means that it is incumbent upon us to not only deconstruct a wrong theory, but to explain the people who invented the theory and the institutions that produced them and supported them. In this 40-some year diversion, in the same way, we ask the question, from whence came the 1619 Project? That's a sociological question. From whence came settler colonialism? And who are the actors who produce and promote both of them? So it's not just the theory, it is a sociology of the theory, which might mean a social psychology of the producers of the theories. Whew.
Okay, well, that was a very thorough and in-depth free school as usual. I feel like it's been a really fulfilling past few weeks. I think it's 3 weeks we've been reading Hegel. And I'm looking forward to next week, continuing where we left off. But I want to thank everyone who is obviously on the screen with me today, but also in the comments participating. And we're really looking forward to seeing you next week as well. But for now, that's it. Goodbye.
Bye.